IB Nation, what's going on? Ryan Roberts here, coming to you live for the Irish Breakdown podcast. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm solo today, but that's okay. Appreciate the patience as we work through a little bit of technical issue, but we are back and ready to get diving in to a first glance at the Ohio State Buckeyes. We're going to take you through a little bit of the offense and defense, some scheme stuff, some progression, potential regression, players to watch. We're going to kind of break it down all this week, and this is the initial first conversation and the first look at the Ohio State Buckeyes. Unfortunately for me, Brian Driscoll was not able to join me right this present moment to join the podcast, but luckily for you all, because we want to give you as much great content here at irishbreakdown.com as possible, me and Brian pre-recorded a little section of this show to kind of break down the Ohio State Buckeyes. Me and Brian wanted to keep it to 40 minutes, and we went an hour and 15 minutes because we were just geeking out nonstop about football, scheme, all that good stuff. So appreciate everyone for hopping in. Again, before we start this podcast, if you could like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell, because we will have so many podcasts this week for you all, leading you up to the big game, September 3rd, in the shoe against the Ohio State Buckeyes. So if you could do that for me, would genuinely appreciate that. First section, I'll bring you a little bit of that insight into the Ohio State Buckeyes. But of course, as we do every single day, we will also have the mailbag at the end. It's just going to be me solo on the mailbag, but from recruiting to team stuff, college football, whatever you all want to talk about, I am here to answer the question, and I appreciate everybody for joining the show today. And there's already a couple great questions that I have to get to before we start in on a little bit of the scheme of the Ohio State Buckeyes. Wanted to bring up Archer because I noticed that we were having pretty fun conversation about the movie. And so Top Gun Maverick is a show that we have talked a lot about on this podcast, specifically over the last couple weeks. There was even a show where people were sending super chats to dedicate towards my movie ticket, popcorn, soda, whatever I felt like, snow caps, I don't know, whatever I was going to get at the movies. So I needed to answer this question as we start here. Archer asked, did we get confirmation yet whether or not he actually went to see the movie? I can confirm, Archer and the rest of IB Nation, I have not gone to see the movie yet. I actually just got off the phone with Brian a little bit ago, and he was very disappointed in me that I have not still seen the movie yet, but I promise it is on the docket. It will happen probably before the season starts, okay? So don't worry. I'll give you my immediate reaction. Maybe it'll be a message board post. You should sign up for Irish Breakdown message board, by the way, at boards.irishbreakdown.com if you're not on there. And then maybe you'll get an instant reaction to my first viewing of Top Gun Maverick. So wanted to hit on that. Also had a super chat before we get started here from Edward. Edward, I want to butcher your last name, so if you want to send me a pronunciation, I would love to know it. Hard to believe that Notre Dame has so many preseason injuries and Ohio State has not. Please tell me that some of Ohio State starters are also banged up. Well, Edward, the only guy that I've heard about specifically is Evan Pryor, who was expected to have a pretty nice role with them as kind of that gadgety running back slot type of player. He is not out for the season with injury, but we will see coming up to game time if there's any recurring issues that we're just not hearing from the back view. Obviously covering Notre Dame here, not covering Ohio State. Every team this time of year is dealing with some course of injury, right? Some string of injuries. The question is the severity. So we'll get into that. We'll keep you updated as we hear more about the kind of the back channel of injuries and speculation and rumors, all that good stuff. We'll make sure to hit on it, Edward. But thank you so much for that super chat. So like I said, we're going to hit on a lot of Ohio State scheme today, both offensively and defensively. We'll talk about what you should expect from them schematically, from a strength perspective, from a questions that they'll need to answer perspective. Me and Brian went a long time on this one, so we hope you all enjoy. Going to share my screen and get us going here. Mailbag afterwards. So if you have any questions, you can start putting them in right now. I will be starring throughout the show, and I will have all the time in the world after this. Well, that's a little hyperbolic, but I will have a lot of time for you all to answer as many great questions as possible because it is game week. We're only a couple days away from the Irish taking on the Ohio State Buckeyes. I know I am juiced up for the opening game. So we're going to get into a little bit of what the Ohio State Buckeyes have to offer and what we should be looking forward is on the Notre Dame side of things. So here we go. Let's get into it.
So let's dive into the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ryan, Notre Dame's first opponent in week 1. Big test for Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. And we're going to have a lot breaking down the Buckeyes the rest of this week. Tomorrow, we're going to have a breakdown, sort of an on-paper matchup. How does Notre Dame stack up against the Buckeyes on paper? Try to give some context to that. Within that, we'll be discussing some of the matchups, the individual matchups that factor into it, whether it be Jackson Smith and Jigba versus specific corner or O-line versus D-line as a whole. We'll have a lot of that Thursday. We will break down the keys to victory for Notre Dame in all phases of the game. And then, of course, on Friday, we will have our predictions for Notre Dame and Ohio State. Plus, we're going to have some fun this year with predictions. We're going to have also predictions for some of the big games this weekend. So we're going to do Oregon, Georgia. We're going to do Utah, Florida. We're going to do Arkansas, Cincinnati, and maybe might pick a couple other games. So we'll see. But, Ryan, let's first kind of introduce people to Ohio State. Obviously, this is one of the best teams in the country, has been for several years. It started under Urban Meyer. The Buckeyes went 12-0 in 2002, and then the next year started the season off 12-0 before losing the Big Ten championship game to Michigan State and then the Orange Bowl to Clemson. The next year, they bounced back by doing what? Winning the national championship. Lost an early season home game to Virginia Tech, but rolled the rest of the way. 2015, I would argue that if Notre Dame wasn't the most talented team in the country that year, when they were healthy, Ohio State was. I think those were the two most just top-to-bottom roster talented teams in the country. Met in the Fiesta Bowl, which Ohio State won that year. 2016, the Buckeyes were a playoff team. 2017, the Buckeyes were they had a down year by going 11-2. I believe that year they won. That they beat USC, and I believe the Cotton Bowl. I think that year was I forget which one it was. It was Cotton Bowl or Peach Bowl. Yeah. 2018 went 13-1, barely missed the college football playoffs. That was one of those weird years, Ryan, where there was like 3 undefeated teams, including Notre Dame, in the college football playoff, and so they didn't get in. Oklahoma made it with a loss that season, and Kyler Murray was part of that team. Dwayne Haskins had a brilliant year, and they went and beat Washington in the Rose Bowl. 2019, Buckeyes went back to the college football playoff after an undefeated season and took Clemson down to the wire in a game that Ohio State really controlled a lot of the action. If it wasn't for number 16 in orange and white, the Buckeyes would have been playing for the championship yet again against LSU. Result probably would have been the same. That was an incredible, incredible LSU team. 2020, Buckeyes back to the playoff again after going an impressive 6-0 in the regular season that year during a COVID-shortened year. No disrespect to the Buckeyes, but I'm sorry, a team that played 6 games should have been in the playoff that year. But Ohio State, once again, proved that they belong there. Because if you remember back in 2014, they were the controversial pick over TCU and Baylor, who they had been ranked ahead of or behind the entire time. Then they beat Wisconsin, who I think was ranked 13th at the time, 59-0. Buckeyes said, okay, you don't think we belong here? Fine, let's go win the whole thing. And they at least took the first step in 2020, blasted Clemson, who had been sort of their nemesis. I mean, if you think about it, Clemson beat them in the Orange Bowl after the 2013 season, beat them 31-0 in 2016 in the playoff. And then, of course, the year prior with Trevor Lawrence had a comeback victory over Ohio State. Ohio State made sure there would be no comebacks by Trevor Lawrence in the last game of his career and absolutely blasted Clemson, went to the championship game, got beat convincingly by Alabama in a game where I think their lack of opportunity that year to really be tested hurt them, in my opinion. And Alabama beat them convincingly, but Alabama was going to beat whoever they played in the championship that year convincingly. That was a really, really good Alabama team. So Ryan Day has had a level of consistency since he took over in 2019. He has not been able to kind of get over that hump and win a championship. Urban Meyer won a championship in year 3. I believe Jim Tressel won it in year 2, correct? If I remember correctly.
Sounds right.
Year 2 or 3. Right. So Ryan Day obviously has that lacking at this point in time. That's not an insult. We're just statement of fact. I think that's the expectations in Ohio State. He did win a title in year 2, by the way. We were correct. So that's kind of where Ohio State is. And they're coming into the season, Ryan, top 5 team, absolutely a team that people are looking at as a chance to compete for championship, and a team that I think, no matter what happens in the opener, if somebody doesn't knock Ohio State out of the playoff, as we've said this before, in the next first 5-6 weeks, like meaning a couple losses, this is not a team you're going to want to be playing in November. A whole regular season of Justin Fry coaching the O-line, a whole regular season of Jim Knowles implementing his defense. This is going to be a team that's going to be much more dangerous at the end of the year than they will be at the beginning, and they're still going to be really good at the beginning of the season.
Well, Brian, I was reminded quickly while doing the recruiting breakdowns for both sides of the coin that Ohio State's pretty talented, man.
Yeah.
They got a lot of guys on that team, I mean, the offense is something that I'm excited to get into because there is a lot of optimism, as there should be on a year-to-year basis, because I know we've had some question marks as far as like, is Ryan Day the guy that can elevate a program? Because he took over I'm not a big Urban Meyer guy, but like it was in a good spot, right? Like
he may be a bad person, but he's a heck of a football coach.
Oh, a great college football coach. And he left Ohio State in a pretty good situation. He did. And Ryan Day, give him credit. He went in there and he continued the level of consistency. But last year, there were some step backs. I mean, from an offensive line perspective, from a defensive perspective, you're bringing in Jim Knowles, which is going to completely shake up this defensive system. So there are some question marks now entering to what's this year 4, I believe, of Ryan Day. So it's going to be interesting to see, but without question, there's a lot of talent on this roster. There's no doubt about it. It's just about, can this coaching staff now develop better than they did last year? Because it was not a great football team for Ohio State last year. There was a lot of talent, like there always is, and there's always going to be games where they just out-athlete people, and the Jimmies and the Joes kind of rise to the forefront. But in order to be a national title contender, which they have been pretty consistently, they have to be able to develop and coach the talent that they have better.
Yeah.
And
I think a national title winner. Exactly. I think they're a contender. I mean, they've played for the title once. They've been in the playoff 2 of his first 3 years. It's about taking that next step and getting over the hump. It's about, can you develop the defense? Because you like look at that 2019 team, talk about, they kind of, unfortunately, that might have been their most complete team.
Yeah.
Now, their offense in 2019 wasn't as good as it was in 21, but the defense was excellent under Jeff Hafley. I mean, 13 points a game. And Clemson had to do everything they could to get the points that they got. I mean, that was a really good Clemson team that they lost to. The thing that hurt Ohio State that year was it just was one of those years where there were just 2 teams, in my opinion, that were just better than everybody else. And LSU, and then a tier below LSU was Clemson, then a tier below Clemson was everybody else.
Yeah.
And that included Ohio State. And really, I would say roster-wise, Ohio State might have had a better team top to bottom. I mean, you think about some of the guys they had in the secondary that year. You had Chase Young, a defensive end, but that's the quarterback. With all due respect to Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence was just a different cat. He was just a different kind of cat.
Agree.
And so, they've done a great job. It's just about, like you said, can he take him over that final hump and win a championship instead of competing for a championship? And, I think that there's an interesting corollary between him and Lincoln Riley. And I think they're widely considered 2 of the best, if not the 2 best offensive minds in the game. I'd say 2 of, because I think Sark belongs in that conversation.
Sure.
Lane Kiffin belongs in that conversation. There's some other guys that belong in the conversation, but you can't have that conversation without Ryan Day and Lincoln Riley. Here's the difference between the 2. Number one, I think that Ryan Day has had, even with his issues on defense, has still had more complete teams than what Oklahoma had. I think that Ohio State consistently faces better teams. And I think that Ohio State hasn't had the slow regression backwards like Oklahoma has. And this year is going to determine if that continues or not, because it was really year 4 where you started to see Lincoln Riley really kind of, I don't think get exposed because they were still pretty good, but where you could see like this isn't the same team. They don't run the ball the way they used to. They don't have the toughness they did when Bob Stoops was there. Yeah. They've really fallen back. I think in this regard,
I just say, Brian, like they plateaued and then they started treading water, I think is where you get to, right? Like I
would even say maybe started to take, like last year's Oklahoma team was not good compared to other teams. So I like the moves that Ryan Day made, to be honest with you. I don't know. I mean, we'll see how they pan out like this season, but look, Jim Knowles is a good defensive coordinator. At the very least, he's a good defensive coordinator. He's never had talent like he's going to have in Columbus the next few years. Justin Fry was a very good hire as the offensive line coach. I mean, he was a guy that interviewed in 2017 or 2018 when Harry Hiestand left. honestly, far more deserving than the guy that they hired. If we're going to be honest with you, the players liked him. He was a Steve Adazio disciple. And you don't want to be a Steve Adazio disciple if we're talking about his job as a head coach, but you do want to be a Steve Adazio disciple if we're talking about offensive line play.
100%.
There's no doubt about that. And so I thought that was a great hire. And what it showed me is they went 11-2. Mm-hmm. They lost 2 games to good football teams. They won the Rose Bowl. We saw a situation like this in Notre Dame in 2015 where the head coach was like, we're a play here, a play there, mistake here, mistake there from being undefeated and playing for a championship. Ryan Day didn't have that. And so he made 0 changes the offseason. Ryan Day didn't do that. Ryan Day said, this isn't the standard, right? 11-2, averaging a bunch of points and all that and winning the Rose Bowl. That's not the standard. The standard is we're going to go out and try to compete for a championship. And they fell short. And he said, we're going to make the changes needed to get over the hump. And that shows me the side of a coach who understands I'm not just this great offensive mind. I need to be the head coach. Mm-hmm. And that is something that impressed me about what Ryan Day did this offseason.
I mean, beyond impressed, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, a lot of coaches don't have, the self-awareness to make that type of move in that type of situation. I mean, usually it's a team bottoming out at 4-8 that kind of makes that move. And, all due respect to the Notre Dame, kind of push there. Right. But like, usually that's not a Brian Kelly shade. Like there's a lot of coaches like that. Like, until you hit the floor, you don't go, wow, I need to really kind of change and reevaluate. And shout out to Ryan Day. I'll give him all the credit for that. He saw a good football team and he said, but that's not good enough. Right. And he did it very quickly, which, he has to give you optimism if you're an Ohio State fan. And again, he's only entering year 4. It's not like he's been there forever. We're like, you have kind of the leeway to make those changes incredibly quickly. Right. He had a very quick self-evaluation, a critical evaluation for his young team, his young staff, and him as a young coach himself. Right. So I think that's a lot. I think that's great self-awareness and a really good sign for the Ohio State.
Because he made a good defensive hire on his first staff, and he hired Jeff Hafley. That was a great hire. And the success they had resulted in Jeff Hafley getting a head coaching job. So it's not like he went out and hired Kerry Coombs and then kept him for 3 years like somebody we know. You know what I mean? Like he made that hire and he realized quickly last year that he had made the mistake and he's trying to fix it. And he didn't go hire like Alex Grinch, who was, struggling at his previous job like Lincoln Riley did when he hired Alex Grinch away from Ohio State. He went out and got a coach that had taken a team known for offense and turned them into one of the best defenses in the country. Yes. And so, again, we'll see if it works. And because you really never know how a hire is going to work. I mean, we think it's going to work out pretty well eventually. We both respect Jim Knowles quite a bit, but you don't ever truly know. So we're just throwing some reservation like we would for any other coaching hire. But on paper, it made a ton of sense for him to go out and get Jim Knowles. And so we'll see how it develops. So let's jump into the 2022 Buckeyes, Ryan. And we're going to start by just kind of taking a quick glimpse at who they were last year. And when you look at Ohio State last year, obviously, as we said, the Buckeyes went 11-2, lost to Oregon at home early in the season, 35-28, lost to Michigan in the final game of the regular season, 42-27, which knocked the Buckeyes out of the college football playoff conversation and the Big Ten championship hunt. So they got knocked out with that loss to the Wolverines. First time Michigan had beaten them since 2011. And that Luke Fickell bridge year between Jim Tressel and and Urban Meyer. So last time Michigan had beaten them. And then before that, Michigan hadn't won in several years. It was like the second win in 15 years for Michigan in that, which is hilarious that all the Michigan fans are like, Ohio State hasn't beaten Michigan in 1,000 days or something. Yeah, it's because you ducked them in 2020 COVID was your reason you ducked them in 2020 when you got curb stomped by Ohio State. But whatever, that's a different conversation for a different day. But in the other games, Ryan, you had a competitive win over Minnesota on the road in a game where Minnesota was outplaying Ohio State for about 2.5, 3 quarters. Buckeyes stepped up in money time after Muhammad Ibrahim went down and won that one 45-31. Penn State battled them tough, but Ohio State again did what they needed to do to get the W, 33-24. Played not well at all on the road against Nebraska, but pulled out the win. And they showed last year against Utah as well as another example of they showed they can win ugly. It doesn't always have to be everything clicking for them to get W's. And that's why we point out those competitive games is not to act like, hey, they're beatable. Everybody's beatable. But more to point out is they don't just steamroll people. They showed last year that they also at times know how to win some of those competitive games as well. And that'll be obviously, I think, a key for this Notre Dame Ohio State game. But This right here, Ryan, this graphic right here shows who Ohio State was last year.
Yep.
And also why the changes needed to be made. These are Big Ten ranks. So as you can see, Ryan, the Buckeyes, 45.7 points per game last year, ranked number 1 in the Big Ten. They also ranked number 1 in the Big Ten in total offense, yards per play, rushing yards per attempt, passing yards per game, passing yards per attempt, second only to Nebraska in yards per completion, first in rating, first in third down offense, first in overall red zone offense, and first in allowing the fewest turnovers possible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for context, we the way we always do this, we kind of look at how teams stack up in their conference just to give an idea. But I mean, Ohio State's offense last year, Ryan, wasn't just number 1 in scoring in the Big Ten. They were number 1 in scoring in the entire country at 45.7, and their 561.2 was also 25 yards ahead of Western Kentucky, who was the number 2 team in the country in yards per game. So they were the most productive offense in the entire country last year. And even in their 2 losses, Ryan, they averaged 27.5 points per game. If Notre Dame could get to 27.5 points per game in their big games, they would have a few more wins on their docket. There's no doubt about it. They'd have 2 wins over Georgia, that's for sure. And they had a shot at some other ones. But the other side of the coin, it was the issue, Ryan. It's yes. You're finishing 9th out of 14 teams in points per game, yards per game, 8th in yards per play, average 5.3 yards per play. Obviously, that's not going to get it done in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Just kind of for context purposes, again, they're 5.3 yards per play. That's kind of close to where Notre Dame was in 2016. In 2016, when Notre Dame went 4-8, they averaged they gave up 5.4 yards per play. So not quite Brian Van Gorder territory, but creeping up on it, and that's why changes needed to be made. And they made them. Rushing yards per game, middle of the pack, rushing yards per play, middle of the pack. Part of the reason that they finished that low in rushing yards is because they were so far ahead in so many games that teams had to throw. Right. And because when teams could be competitive, they could run on Ohio State, as we saw in their losses last season. Finished 7th and 12th in passing yards allowed. Passing yards allowed can always be a little bit of a misleading stat, Ryan, simply because when you're up 42-7, the other team's going to throw the ball, and they're going to. I mean, you throw it enough, they're going to get some. They're going to get some yards out of it. 7th in yards per attempt, 6th in yards per completion. Those are a little bit more in line with where you are as a passing offense or passing defense, yards per attempt, yards per completion, I think, than total yards, which are circumstance related. 9th in rating, pass efficiency defense, 13th in third down defense, 12th in overall red zone defense. But they were at least decent in the Big Ten for getting turnovers with 20 on the season. So that's a little bit of a statistical look at the Buckeyes, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting numbers. I feel like we should have a Brian Van Gorder line, right? Like if it's anywhere close to Van Gorder, then it's in dangerous territory, right? But I mean, it's well documented how bad the defense was last year. And it's a coaching issue. It was a development issue. And it was, I mean, Brian, if you look at those offensive numbers, if I just kind of blindly put it up there and said, like, that's Ohio State, you would think, well, that's going to contend for a national championship, right? With how the defense has been in the past, but with what it was last year, you're not even in the ballpark, if we're being honest. Like, they would not have played with Georgia or Alabama last year, in my opinion.
No, Ryan, if Notre Dame had those offensive numbers, they'd have multiple championships over 100%. The last 5 years.
100%.
I mean, they would, because of how good their defense has been. And that's why he brought in Jim Knowles. It's, hey, we're not going to be Oklahoma. The reason you make this kind of move is because you don't want to be Lincoln Riley. You don't want to be Oklahoma. You don't want to win 45-41 shootouts all the time, because when you get to the postseason against Alabama and Clemson and some of these other teams, you're not going to be able to win those shootouts that way. You need to make stops, right? And so that's why you make the move to Jim Knowles, because he wants to be the 2019 version of Ohio State, not like Oklahoma. The 2013 version of Ohio State, obviously, was a team that also averaged 40 points a game. They averaged 46.9 points per game, actually more points than they averaged last year, even though I would argue that their offense wasn't as explosive or as dynamic as it was this past season. But why do they average so many more points? Because their offense had a lot more opportunities. In 2019, Ohio State ran 1,069 plays. And now that was like one more game, 6.9 yards per play. Even though Ohio State averaged 46.9 I think it's 46.9 points per game that year, 45.7 last year. But if you look at some of the other numbers, Ryan, they were 529.9 in yards per game, which is significantly lower than Ohio State this past year. They were 6.9 yards per play, significantly lower. So why did they score more points? Because they had more opportunities because the defense made stops. And the defense in 2019 only gave up 13.7 points per game, gave up 259 yards per game, 4.1 yards per play compared to 372.6 and 5.3 last year.
Right.
So it's a big difference. And that's where Ryan Day, I think, wants to be. He understands if you're going to beat Alabama, if you're going to beat LSU when they have their Joe Burrow years, if you're going to beat Clemson, if you're going to beat Notre Dame and those type of teams, you're going to have to be able to make stops. And that's why he made the move that he made to get to that point in time. So, when you kind of look at it, that's what's going to ultimately determine where this team is going to be, does the move he made to bring in Jim Knowles pay off? And we'll find out. Obviously September 3rd will be a first example. I would encourage people not to get too excited or too upset one way or the other. If Notre Dame has a big game, it's a defense that's going to take some time to learn. If Notre Dame struggles, Brian Van Gorder's defense also did pretty well in the beginning of his first year. So it's going to take some time to really truly know. But I think no matter what happens in the opener, I'm confident based on his work at Duke. And I mean, he built some decent defenses at Duke, Ryan. I mean, especially their secondary. They built some really quality secondaries at Duke, which is impressive when you consider just the lack of talent. And also it's important to note that, and you've made a comment about Oklahoma State. They weren't a really talented secondary. They weren't.
No.
Just individual players.
I don't think they were a very talented defense overall. If we're being,
I think I had a couple guys that I thought were really talented. I love Malcolm Rodriguez as a player. Sure. I think he's a really good college football player.
100%.
One of their interior guys I thought was, I think it was like 90, 95 or 98. I forget which kid it was. Pretty good player, pretty disruptive in the games I saw. I think the freshman that they had, Colin Martin or Colin Oliver. Was a pretty twitchy kid, but like Brock Martin, he's just a savvy, high motor type of guy. He's not a super talented guy. The other linebacker was just okay. Their secondary was just, honestly, their secondary had a bunch of Clarence Lewis type guys in there athletically, if we're being honest about it, but they were incredibly well coached and incredibly well schemed. So he's been able to get production out of secondaries that aren't going to have the talent that Ohio State will have moving forward. Now, does Ohio State have the 2015 talent or the 2019 talent in the secondary? No, they don't. We've talked about that. But it's still better than a lot of other people. It's kind of like what we talk about Notre Dame. Like, does Notre Dame not need to get better in certain areas? Yeah. Are they still better than most teams that they're going to play or most teams in the country? Yeah. There's a lot of teams in college football that would love to have Notre Dame's secondary problem, right? I mean, a lot of teams. And same thing with, a lot of teams that would love to have how are we going to be good on offense when we've got Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey and Deion Colsey, Jaden Thomas, Tobias Merriweather, Joe Wilkins, Michael Mayer, how are we going to be getting good on offense? There's a lot of teams that would love to have that problem. But we're talking about teams that are trying to compete for championships. And so the standard is different, and that's where Ohio State is.
I look forward to seeing, just kind of honing in on Jim Knowles for a second. I look forward to seeing what his goal is year one, right? Because the places he's been, we've talked about it a bunch. It's taken till year 2, year 3 to really get things turned around. Now he's going to have a lot more talents in Ohio State than he's had anywhere else.
Higher expectations too.
100%. I mean, again, because we said 11-2 wasn't good enough. That's the standard that we're working with right now, right? Like I think that Ryan Day brought him in because he said we need to get better quickly, not better in 3 years.
Yeah,
right?
Ohio State expects to compete for a championship this year. It's not
100%.
Hey, get you. And to your point, Ryan, the thing we have pointed out, just for people who maybe didn't hear it, was Jim Knowles' first-year defense at Duke and his first-year defense at Oklahoma State both gave up more points, more yards, and more yards per play than the previous team where the coach had gotten replaced. But the expectations were different. At Duke, he was brought in to change over something, and he was you have time to get it turned around. So, hey, we're going to just do what we do. And then eventually recruit to it, and guys will learn it. Same thing in Oklahoma State. At Ohio State, it's like you don't have a year to get it right. You can't be worse than you were last year. You got to come in and change it so that how does he blend? We got to win now with installing his defense. That's going to be a really fascinating aspect to see what Jim Knowles does this year because
and
it's a
I would
different
say,
standard for him.
Yeah, 100% a different standard, which is again like if you get a slow start in Oklahoma State fans are going to be like, okay, we understand.
We knew it was going to be a process,
turnaround.
right?
Yeah, it was tough
Right.
turnarounds. Ohio State fans are not going to be patient like that,
No.
and they shouldn't be. I mean, again, the standards are high. I don't think they
Right.
should be, and I do think that I mean. I really like Jim Knowles. I really do because I mean, you talk about the shift, Brian. I know the Big 12 had a little bit of a shift from an offensive heavy conference to a little more defensive in 2021. But I mean, talk about the shift of Oklahoma State's program. They were a run and gun, throw the ball over the yard, all that type of stuff with the Brand Whedon era and all that. And then all of a sudden, they're a defensive led program, right?
Yeah.
This past year. Like that's where their bread and butter was the ability to run the football and to play great defense. That's how they had their success in 2021. So there was a dramatic shift, but again, that dramatic shift, if there's going to be one for Jim Knowles, needs to be a lot quicker in Columbus than it happened in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
So just for context purposes, I'm trying to look at see what I'm trying to remember what his first year was with Oklahoma State. So just give me one. It was 2018. So his first year, 2018. Actually, I was incorrect. They gave up. Yes, no, I was right. In 2017, the year before he got there, they gave up 29.4 points per game. Ooh. In his first year in 2018, they gave up 32.5. So in 2018, they gave up 32.5 points per game. By 2020, really, they gave up 30.2, but it was a little fewer games. But then by 2020, they gave up 23.5. Excuse me, they were down to 23.5. So by year 3, they're down to 23.5. That's almost 10 points lower. And then, of course, last year they saw a big jump and went to 18.1. Now, 18.1 points per game in the Big 12 is really impressive.
Yes, it is.
And that includes giving up 35 points in the bowl game to a Notre Dame offense that was pretty good that day without Jim Knowles. So if you look at the Jim Knowles only led defenses, it's in the 17s, I believe, because you'd take out the 35 points at Notre Dame, and it's like 500 and some yards that Notre Dame put up on him. So it took him some time, but he was also inheriting a much worse defense than the one he's going to inherit at Ohio State. Like Ohio State fans are all ticked off, and rightfully so, because of a defense that gave up like 23 points a game last year. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a full touchdown better already starting point than what he inherited at Oklahoma State. Right. Sure. So there's a little bit of a reason for it. But we're going to talk first, Ryan, as we break down the Buckeyes, and we're just going to kind of give you all what our first glance show is going to be. It's not going to be like this really in-depth statistical analysis of the matchup that'll come tomorrow. It's not going to be an in-depth X's and O's matchup. There's just, it's more of just giving you an idea of what you're going to see. And we're going to first start with the Ohio State offense, because this is a really fascinating offense, because Ryan Day is I believe a great game planner and a great play caller, but it's not a really complex offense. It's an offense built on several aspects. Number one, they're primarily an 11 personnel team. That's definitely the number one personnel grouping that they like to use. And they will do some 10, they'll do some 12, they'll get a couple tight ends in certain situations. They'll go under center at times, much more so under Ryan Day than they did previously in previous coordinators, whether it was Kevin Wilson or Tim Beck or Ed Warner or Tom Herman before them. But they'll go under center a little bit. It wasn't as effective for them last year. That was more of a blocking issue than anything else. I expect them to still do that this season and really ramp up their run game out of that, but then also in hopes of setting up a more effective pass game, play action pass game out of that, I think is the reason you want to still stick with that type of thing. Because if you can establish a running game from under center on top of the other things you do, I think that makes them very dangerous. Their base offense, however, Ryan, is they want to spread people out. They're going to get wide receiver splits. They're going to motion. They're going to shift. They're going to start in 3-by-1, go to 2-by-2, start in 2-by-2, go to 3-by-1. Try to get you moving, get you thinking, try to out leverage you, try to space you out. They want to create openings, and a lot of the stuff they do pass game wise is built around creating some sort of level, whether it's triangle concepts, whether it's straight pure levels concepts that come off mesh, whether it's vertical levels, post drags, things along those lines. They also like to do a lot of horizontal stretch. They'll run 4 verts, but they'll do it different ways. They'll post snap switch, their number 2 and number 3, or their number 1 and number 2 in a 3x1. They'll do a lot of different things to try to get you communicating and communicating wrongly. The more you have to communicate post snap as a defense, the more chance there is that somebody doesn't get the communication and they turn guys loose. And we see that constantly. You're thinking they run the same mesh type concept over and over, and yet they're still getting guys open. Why? Because they're coming at you from 3x2, 2x2, 3x1, bunch. And they'll do different things to clear open that mesh. And it's really well designed, even though it's not something where you're like, wow, that's Sean McVay level complexity. It's not that. That's actually a compliment for me. Yeah. Because they don't have to run a million plays. They have certain philosophies they do, and they get to those philosophies in a lot of different ways with a lot of different people. And I think that's a big reason for their success. I mean, it's lazy to me to just say, well, it's just because they have better players than everybody else. Well, they do, but that's not why all of a sudden Ohio State's averaging 45, 46, 47 points per game right now under Ryan Day.
Ryan Day, he's the master, and I know listeners hear me say this all the time, creating and manipulating space. That is what his game does. And I love that you started with mesh, Brian, as like the main example. For people that don't know, mesh is crossing, right?
And we'll break that down here in a little bit, yeah.
Right. But even in a concept of mesh that is kind of run off the same concepts of crossing routes, they do stuff like mesh sits, where they'll get someone in the middle of the field to sit down in the mid hole. They'll talk about mesh rail, where they get the running back to run a wheel off of the concept. It's the same concept, but they have different things working off of it. So everything looks the same, except it's about taking the defenders off guard.
And which defenders they're trying to stress changes depending on how they do it. Sometimes it's putting the linebackers in a bind. So like they'll do mesh concepts, but you got this 12 to 15 yard stop route underneath. Sometimes it's, sometimes it's 2 guys going on mesh. Sometimes it's 1 guy running across, and they're creating sort of a mesh, but not in a traditional mesh sense. They're just running through the outside shoulders of the inside linebackers and then taking like you said, the running back on a swing or a rail. So now they're actually isolating the backside flat defender with a crosser coming from the other side of the field. So it's really it's not complex stuff for the offense, but it puts the defense in a lot of different types of binds. It creates a lot of need for communication. Then when you factor in the fact that their guys are really talented, it makes them even better. Even like their spacing, their stops, they'll do stops and comebacks on the outside. They'll do kind of like quick out cuts, things like that. But it's all designed to isolate their guy against your guy. So they're either going to create isolations with levels concepts, mesh concepts, or they're going to do horizontal stretches where they're going to use wide splits from their receivers or different alignments or motions to say, hey, we're now in a one-on-one concept to the boundary because of how we've been able to manipulate you pre-snap. We've now got our field receiver in a one-on-one. We've got our boundary in a one-on-one. We now know based on how you're lined up that our number 3 is going to be in a one-on-one on a backside seam against somebody, right? And so he's really good at that. And then from there, the quarterback knows where to go with the ball.
And it's not a one read clear out anything, right? Like there's options off of everything. Yeah. There's multiple, because they are trying to make defenders wrong. Ultimately, they understand that a defender is going to have an obligation and a leverage to play, and whatever leverage they choose to take, they are going to, as I knock over my water,
he's so fired up.
Take the option that is open.
Well, it's like even like I was talking about that backside seam concept, like they may manipulate that to say, hey, we like this backside seam, but you're going to read that to where if the safety comes over or a linebacker drops, you've got your comeback on the outside, or you've got your back on a swing or a back on a check down. That's another thing they do. They use their backs really well as escape valves. Number 1, I think they do a lot of stuff with their backs. So they'll just run 4 verts, and all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, you've got everybody covered deep, and shoot, we didn't account for Travion Henderson just kind of curling up right behind the line 5 yards down the field, and you check it down to him and there's nobody there. or
that's
Jeremy
why he
Ruckert.
averaged over 11 yards a catch last year.
Correct.
Right. Yeah.
Correct. So, I mean, he had 27 catches. Mayan Williams had 9. So that's 30 plus catches right there. Marcus Crowley had a catch. Master Teague had a couple catches. So, I mean, you're talking about Evan Pryor had a couple. You're talking about like 40 touches to your backs. When you consider how many touches the receivers get, that's a lot of production, And a lot of it comes on swing routes. It comes on the checkdowns. They'll run some screens, right? They do some stuff where the backs are designed to get the ball, but a lot of that is, okay, you want to bail 8 or 7 to take away our vertical stuff? Cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'll check it down to Travion Henderson in space, and we'll be good to go. We'll get the 10 easiest yards we've ever gotten in the pass game. So it really does put you in a lot of different binds, and that's what I really like about it. So
I think a quick note, Brian, before we get into the film, is that also just historically under Ryan Day, the tight ends have also not been featured much, right? Like they usually, that's more of a wide receiver and then running back kind of supplements some of that production, which is just kind of interesting that the tight end has not been like a really showcased player in their offense.
Right. Well, in last year with Jeremy Ruckert, honestly was some of the most production they've had on their tight end under Ryan Day. I mean, Jeremy Ruckert last year had 26 catches for 309 yards. Cade Stover had 5 for 76. G. Scott had 5. Mitch Rossi had 4. That's like getting over 40 catches for their tight ends. That's a lot for them. I mean, that for what they've done in the past. I mean, 2019, their top 2 tight ends, Ruckert and Luke Farrell, combined for 21 catches. They ended up only having 25 in the whole year. So to your point, they don't use the tight end a ton. I'm curious how they're going to use Cade Stover this year. That's going to be because he's a pretty athletic kid.
Yep. Not
nearly as big as Jeremy Ruckert was. I mean, Jeremy Ruckert was a prototype 6'5", 6'6" tight end. Cade Stover's more of like a 6'3", 230 kind of kid, with some speed and some athleticism. I'm very curious how they're going to use him this year as a blocker and then in the pass game. Yep. So that's going to be a fascinating aspect to what they do. So let's dive into film a little bit, Ryan. And this is an example of what we're kind of talking about from just an alignment standpoint. This is a 11 personnel a look. That is a receiver, right? This is a tight end right here. Okay. This is a receiver right here. And this is a receiver right here. And Ryan, basically what they're doing is they're just running a basic curl flat concept to the boundary. And they're running essentially a triangle concept to the field, which is basically a curl flat with a third guy involved, essentially. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes they'll run just mirrored curl flat, but I don't see that a ton. Normally they're going to get a third guy to a side and they create some sort of triangle concept. So what we have here is you see up top, you see with this receiver up here at the very top of the screen, he's going to run basically like a 13 to 15 yard stop route. We call it a curl. Going to get a mirrored route at the bottom down here so that you're going to get the same concept here. This is just going to be a quick release slide. He's sort of an outlet valve, right? Hey, if they bail, just check it down here. It's basically a check down. Now, this route right here is what is fascinating is we can't really pull up the clips because there's copyright stuff involved, but we're going to kind of walk you through it. So essentially what this is, I believe Jeremy Ruckert, what his job here, Ryan, is he's running through the outside shoulder. He's going to run vertically through the outside shoulder of the linebacker. And he is going to run a stop route down here, as we'll show in a second. The goal is to then put him in a situation where he now has to take the tight end. Because if the tight end crosses his face and kind of comes here, if the tight end comes here in front of him, then he can pass off to the other inside linebacker and then start getting depth and kind of jump underneath a curl route or maybe run with the tight end or the back, right? And so what they're then going to do is then put this guy in the bind. Okay, this guy's going to be a little bit of a bind based on the coverage that they're going to face. So what they do post-snap is obviously then run a wide slide to the running back, and they've got their triangles. Now, the quarterback is going to make his pre-snap read of what he's going to do. My guess is here he's going to throw to the field here. And my reason for why I would say he's going to do it is just because of the corner being down. It could potentially be 2. Safeties walk down a little bit. My thought is that it's going to be cover 4 most likely. But you also have a stand-up backer that could buzz the flats. It's not a bad look for the curl flat, but I think up here it just is a better look to the field, and that's where they end up going with the ball. And we see kind of what that play looks like post-snap. So this is kind of where everybody gets to the top end of their routes. You can see what I'm talking about. Now the safety here, he's going to play the middle of the field. So this was the quarter safety over here. He jumps to the middle. He robs this tight end. So I'm getting two guys occupying the tight end. And then now that safety, that flat defender is now in a bind. So you've got him outside. That's the running back. And this corner is now protecting deep because the safety's robbing down inside, Ryan. The corner is now playing the post. Well, it's hard to play the post as an outside corner playing off and then stop and drive on a curl route. Right. And that's just the bind. Because if you're too aggressive trying to take away the stops and the comebacks and the quick stuff, then they'll just run by you. And then you're afraid of getting run by. So that's when they just will kill you with the stop. So if you actually look at this, Ryan, they actually have a window on both sides. Yep. But I think that the quarterback rightly chooses the field side here. And you can see this triangle concept that we talk about here. You can see what it creates, the spacing that they create. This is tremendous. I mean, if you're coaching these concepts, your stop, this is exactly why I stopped it. Look at the incredible spacing that they create with this post-snap route concept. And it's now my dudes against your dudes, and I've now created throwing lanes for my quarterback.
Well, and you talked about the putting that flat defender in a bind with the curl flat there. You're also putting that middle of the field safety in a bind too, because you have the tight end who is occupying two defenders there. And he also has to make a decision. Do I stay in the middle of the field with that inside curl to the tight end, or do I close that outside window?
This guy who is now here on the tight end, just so people can see that.
And since Ruckert's able to hold that safety in the middle of the field, you see that curl up top to, I would assume that's probably Chris Olave, is now, I mean, that window's wide open if that's where CJ Stroud chooses to go to, right? So there's a couple different options on this play, which is why it's a good concept and why every team uses this concept. But you can see just kind of the binds that they put in, not only the shallow defenders, but also the defenders working from depth.
Right. And this is why the decision, I think, to go to the field was a good one, even though I think Garrett Wilson is here for a tight window throw. You had the corner sitting back, you had the safety back, so it was quarters. They're trying to bracket Garrett Wilson, and they did drop that end. So as we see here, you can see that this guy right here, the stand-up end, Maryland would drop that guy into coverage, and that's exactly what happened. So you kind of have to treat that almost like a 3-by-2, right, numbers-wise, Ryan. And so I do think that even though this comes open, the proper pre-snap read is to go to the field. Yep. And then what would happen is what they'll do, Ryan, is if this safety jumps this, it was Chris Olave because this is Garrett Wilson down here. If the safety stays over there and they bracket the outside number 2, you now got Jeremy Ruckert in a one-on-one over the middle of the field, and they had no problem throwing that ball last year. And if you're going to then sit in a one-on-one and have your safety bracket outside, that's when they start running their mesh stuff and some of their other concepts. Like, fine, you want to bracket our outside guys, cool, that's right where we want to be. We got some stuff for you. And speaking of mesh, let's go to that concept, Ryan. So let's kind of walk through this a little bit. This is one of several different types of versions of it. And you say like all the different, exactly. So what they're doing is this is a 3-by-1 concept. Three is just who do you have to a side? There's 3 receivers to the left. You have the outside receiver. You have your slot. There's your tight end in sort of a wing position. You have your running back. And then here is your I believe this was Garrett Wilson out here. And so you're going to do a couple different things. This is the reason I showed this one, Ryan, because it does actually have a pure mesh. So the tight end is running a mesh with the X. Now, there's multiple reads on this, but what this is clearly about the way that they do it, the tight end goes high and Garrett Wilson comes low. So that's a thing that you teach is that you don't have them both running at a same aiming point because then they're going to run into each other, have to avoid each other. One guy goes high. And so what Jeremy Ruckert's job there is his job is to cross the face, get up on. So he's going to release a little bit vertically towards that inside backer and then run right on their toes. That's what you teach them to do. Run on their toes because you're trying to get them to pause. Because if they have to pause at all to deal with you and pass you off, they're not going to have enough speed to run out there with Garrett Wilson, right? Yeah. And then behind that, this is what you were talking about, Ryan, earlier. Behind that, you've got Jackson Smith and Jigba right here running that deep sit route, 12 to 15-yard sit route. So if the linebackers squeeze hard on that, he's running that. And what it also does is it keeps the safeties from driving on the cross. So they've got a post here from I believe this was Chris Olave. So that eats up the front side safety because in this alignment, you're not going to have – I mean, that safety's 12, 13 yards off the ball. That's telling me very clearly the safety's playing post on this play, right? So the way that they played a lot, they're going to end up running both of those guys with the post, I believe, is what they end up doing on this play. So now what you've done is you've created a high-low concept right here with Jackson Smith and Jigba and Garrett Wilson on basically a high-low concept. And, of course, if they don't cover that. Now, here's where it gets interesting, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is now, who's the guy in a bind? It's this guy right here. Now, on paper, right now with this alignment, if you're just talking about the receivers and the tight ends, they can account for everybody. The backside safety can drive on the sit route from Jackson Smith and Jigba. The linebackers can kind of jump. The inside backers can kind of jump the Jeremy Ruckert backside cross. And then the flat defender here, this guy right here, is just sitting there in the window where he's all over Garrett Wilson. So, and then you just double team the post route. Hey, you're good, right? Nope. Because they're going to send – it's not even a wheel, Ryan. They're going to send this running back, and he's basically being taught to just run as fast as you can and get as far downfield as you can. He never looks back for the ball, ever, on this particular play.
It's a clear out, man.
It's a clear out. Exactly. It's a clear out. And it's an incredibly well-designed clear out. So then what you see is this is kind of what happens. So this is the back now. You can see this is the flat defender who now has to run on that. So this is what we're saying, cover two. So the safety's playing post, but what this corner is doing is he's kind of running vertically until somebody threatens him. Well, nobody threatens him until the running back comes. So he's going to keep sinking because they threaten him with the backside X receiver. So you see Jeremy Ruckert gets jumped by the backside by the backside linebackers. Then they're all over Jackson Smith and Jigba's sit route. But now there's nobody here to handle this crossing route from Garrett Wilson. Incredibly, it's like it sounds simple, but it's hard to defend because they'll do different things out of it. And so what happens here is by the time the ball gets thrown, I'm just showing you this open window here, Ryan. The ball gets thrown, Garrett Wilson's going to catch it around here. By that time, this guy's down here, and there's just nobody there.
I mean, you can even see it on – I mean, it's a great picture right here, Brian, because, like, no one's near Garrett Wilson already because Ruckert did a great job, I'm sure.
He did. Kind of just stepped right on their toes, man. He did a great job.
I mean, at the end of the day, man, it's not a complicated concept. Jeremy Ruckert is making contact, being physical through that route, through the routes, and you're creating a lot of miscommunication, and it's almost like a rub to a degree, right? Like there's a little bit of a rub route in this scenario, and you get a wide receiver wide open because it just happens so fast, and you're creating contact. That's the biggest thing, and it's not complicated. It's two crossing routes, but basically, at the end of the day, it is just creating chaos for a second level of the defense.
And the thing is, too, is they teach it so well technically with the tight ends coach, Kevin Wilson and Brian Hartline, because they don't rub. It's accomplishing the same thing as a rub, but they teach. And this is why I say where a lot of coaches get in trouble. And I've heard coaches teach mesh this way, run through his upfield shoulder. No, because then you're going to bang him and it's going to end up getting a chance to be a penalty. I always said, step on his toes, run right in front of his face, step right on his toes, make him, because here's the thing. If he initiates the contact, it's not a rub. Right. It's he hit me. Yes. Right. Make him initiate the contact. So cross his face as close as you possibly can while working across him, as opposed to, running through him. Some say run through him. No, that's how you get called for a rub, right? That's how you get called for a pick. Excuse me. They teach it really well technically. So you don't see them doing, at times they'll pick, right? Let's be honest. At times they will, but they're so good at it that it's kind of hard to see if you're watching it live and seeing it fast like an official. So really, really well-designed concept, Ryan. And if you get – and here's the thing is if you get too peaky into this where you start kind of playing the field and start like really having guys emphasize here, they'll simply put their back opposite over here and, like into the boundary. And if you start playing like man, so then this backside safety here, he's going to drive on the sit route and this guy's going to chase, right, which some teams will do. Well, then now all of a sudden they're just sending the back on a quick swing or wheel, and now all of a sudden he's in space against what? An inside linebacker that's hoping to run with him? I don't think so.
Good luck.
Right? Yeah, or exactly. And then, if this safety is going to say, okay, no, I got the cross by that, or I got the back, or I'll take this or whatever, then all of a sudden you got Jackson Smith and Jigba coming open on the sit route. I mean, it really does put you in a lot of different binds. But here's the key for Notre Dame and any other team. How many people they have in pass pro here, Ryan? Because they got 5 out, right? So they got like 1, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 out. So it's a 5-man protection.
Yep.
This is why it's important to get pressure on the quarterback. Look, they're gonna attack your coverage with as many options as they can, as often as they can. Now they'll put their backs in pass pro. And they'll do some their version of Max Pro, Ryan, which to me is normally 11 personnel and the tight end and back both stay in. That's their version of Max Pro. They'll do that. But in a lot of snaps, Ryan, a lot of snaps, they're trying to get 5 out, even if it's a quick check down. Hey, nobody's blitzing right away, so bam, I'm getting out. Not chipping on an end, not doing that kind of stuff. If that guy doesn't come right now, I'm getting out. They're going to try to stress you that way. So it puts a lot of pressure on your defensive line to say, don't let CJ Stroud look at this pocket. Now, this guy's coming free late, but on a cross route, it's okay. You came late. I'm just getting this sucker out real quick to 5 yards and we're out the gate. And that's what makes it difficult.
That's the nature of the space game too, is that in the space game, you want to get the ball out quick, right? Like you manufactured and created space quickly here in this offense, and the quarterbacks become almost a point guard at this point, right? Like get the ball out quick and let your players work, because we saw Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, all those guys, they can do incredible work just with a sliver of space, right? So that's the biggest thing, is that these quarterbacks get the ball out quick, and these are the concepts that get guys open quickly.
Yeah, I really like these concepts, Ryan. They are a team, like I said, that is offensively, and then of course when they're really rolling, they are running the ball. And I think that's the thing is trying to get you as close to the line of scrimmage as possible so they can take shots. Now, they're not a team that, when you break down the film, they're not a team that makes a living throwing the ball down the field. They don't throw the ball down the field like a million times a game, but they have no problem going there if they need to. No problem going there.
That's the other thing, is like with mesh and stuff, it can kind of lull you to sleep on like the second and third level. As a safety, like it can kind of lull you to sleep a little bit, because you're like, I need to come up, right? Like I need to cut off the mid hole. I need to come up on the cross, do all that type of stuff. And then that's where they hit that backside post occasionally, right? Like that's the big money play. And I think CJ's pretty good as far as a deep ball thrower. Like he makes you pay for the attempts that he has, but I agree with you. It's not like the big part of their offense. It's more, we're going to run our offense, and then when we have our shots, we'll take it.
He was over 50% last year on deep balls, which is, if you're at 50% as often as they throw deep, you're in pretty good shape, in my opinion, throwing the deep ball. That's what I think. I mean, look, you look at last year, Ryan, I mean, CJ Stroud last year threw 62 deep balls last year on, we see his total attempts here, 443 attempts, threw 62 balls that went at least 20 yards past the line of scrimmage. Jack Cohn last year had 385 pass attempts. He threw 54 deep balls. Very, very similar rate of throwing deep. Very similar rate. Now, of course, the difference is Jack Cohn was in the 30% percentage area in completion rate, and they were higher. I mean, I think Ian Book in 2019, I think is what it was. The year he had Chase Claypool and Cole Kmet. That year, Ian Book threw 402 pass attempts. He threw 63 deep and had a 52% completion rate. So, I mean, Notre Dame threw the deep ball in 2019 at a higher rate than Ohio State did last year. Like, that's the thing. It's like they're not a team chucking it down the field. They will strategically go after you, but they're not going to just – what they are going to do, to your point, is their yards come from getting dudes in space and catch and run opportunities, or where I got the ball and I got to beat one guy. And that's what coach is like, look, man, I'm drawing this play up. You're going to get the ball. I need you to beat one guy. That's your job. My job is I did all these other things. That's your job. So let's break down the Ohio State defense a little bit, Ryan. And this is we somewhat a little bit more brief with this, just because there's a lot we don't know about how he's going to adapt his personnel to Ohio State's, or his scheme to Ohio State's personnel. But there are some things that I think that reflect kind of who Jim Knowles is at Oklahoma State and at Duke. He was a 5 DBs on the field kind of guy. More often than not, 3 safeties. He was that way at Duke. They had 3 safeties on the field all the time. And his last secondary at Duke, I thought, was one of the most underrated secondaries in the country.
Mhm.
I mean, I thought that unit was pretty good. I mean, I remember watching that 2017 or 2016 Duke team. That wasn't a very good team, but you could even see it then because those guys were really young. You could kind of see like they got some athletes now running in the secondary. They might be okay in a couple years. And they ended up having a pretty good defense for Duke when you consider the overall lack of talent. But we're going to see an aggressive defense, but not necessarily. I wouldn't call his defense blitz heavy last year at Oklahoma State. It has been in the past, but more of a two linebacker defense. I mean, the basic structure of what he's always done is sort of a 4-2-5.
Yes.
Now, personnel. Now, out of the 4-2-5 personnel, we'll see different things, but I kind of feel like, Ryan, that has been the predominant personnel grouping we've seen from him at Oklahoma State and Duke. Now, will he do that at Ohio State? We've heard things about 3-3-5 and all. So I just think a lot of that is just, mind games. I think they're going to be 4-2-5 personnel. And like Notre Dame last year, at times out of that, you'll see maybe a Jack Sawyer type of person moving around like Isaiah Foskey did and stacking or dropping and things like that. But I think this right here in this graph right here is somewhat of this is kind of who they are, right? From a personnel standpoint, we'll see different looks. But here it is. Basically, it's four down, and this is a true 4-down personnel. I believe this was Colin Oliver right here, if I believe correctly. And they have 2 interior guys and a defensive end, 2 linebackers, and then you have the safety here. This is Tanner McAllister, who transferred to Ohio State. Then 2 back-end safeties and 2 corners. Now, they'll move. What I like about what they do, Ryan, is they'll move guys around a lot. There's actually a play here. Let me see if I can get to it. I don't know if I saved the play or not. Looks like I didn't save the play. But when I broke it down, it was a 4-down. It was a 3-down look.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the Viper. So that would be this player right here. They had this guy right here. He was to the field, kind of off the ball, and they had an odd front. Odd front meaning three down linemen. So you had a guy over the nose, and then 2 linemen over the tackles. Yep. One was sort of like in a 4-eye, and the other one was in a 5. But the interesting thing is personnel-wise, the guy that was weak side here, so like basically like this guy right here, was actually their defensive tackle. Their defensive end and their what would be like the Notre Dame Viper were actually lined up side by side. So the one defensive end was to the field side as kind of like a head up, like looked like it was close to a 5, maybe 4-eye is if I remember correctly. And then the Viper was outside of him. So again, it's about what matchups do we want to do? And he has no problem moving a defensive lineman around, giving you the same look, but saying, hey, I want to get so-and-so in this matchup against this blocker. And I think that's really good coaching. You'll see Tanner McAllister here, as we showed in another look, Ryan, that you had here, this one right here, now against 11 personnel from Baylor. Now he's in the middle of the field. This is a 3 safety look. They don't often stay there. Sometimes they will. They'll kind of have the 3 safeties playing thirds and having corners up. But usually one of these safeties is going to insert from somewhere. But what I like about what they do, and they'll also, Ryan, as you see here, we'll just kind of walk through some of these. But one thing that I like, Ryan, and I'll have you start breaking this down, is one thing you have to be prepared for is right here. There's at least 8 guys that you have to be prepared for coming on this particular play. On this snap right here, Ryan, if you remember correctly, because this is what you broke down, this guy right here, McAllister, fires at snap. They'll bring this corner down here for fire. So as an offensive coach, Ryan, you have to be prepared for them to bring somebody from just about every spot, including the third level of the defense.
Yeah, and I think it's a good way to kind of to phrase it, Brian, is, Notre Dame fans are very familiar with the 4-2-5, right? Like they've seen it under Elko and Lee, and a little different under Marcus Freeman, but still there's some known there from a 4-2-5. Oklahoma State, compared to how Notre Dame used their rover, who's kind of more of a linebacker safety hybrid type player, they use a true like 4-2-5 nickel look, right? So like that guy is a true defensive back. And in this look, the biggest takeaways I have from Jim Knowles last year is they don't, and we talked about this before the show, they don't like stunt and twist a lot up front. They will slant the defense, the line a lot, and they'll bring a defender from an unoccupied gap. So let's just explain that real quick, Ryan.
Yeah. So the difference here, right? So when we talk about a stunt is, so on this particular play, for example, A stunt would be this defensive tackle right here. This guy right here is going to work outside. So you can see that he's going to work outside. And then this defensive end will kind of loop around this way.
Yep.
Right. And so like they kind of, it's like a post snap switch. That's a stunt. What Ryan is saying is they'll slant, and they talk about the job they did with that against Baylor too, Ryan, since a lot of these clips are from the Baylor game. But I went back and watched the Oklahoma game. I watched the TCU game, Texas Tech, the Notre Dame game, which is, I didn't watch a ton for this prep because it wasn't Jim Knowles running the defense. A slant is basically like they'll all kind of go in one direction. So they'll start here, but then they all slant a gap or two over in that regard. So that's the difference between a stunt and a slant, just so people understand, that. But please, Ryan, continue.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, and in this play specifically, they slanted all the defensive linemen to the boundary.
To the left.
They went to
the defense is left, correct.
Yes, to the defense is left. And then they brought Tanner McAllister, who is that slot defender, to the top. They brought him off the edge. So they end up getting 5 rushers on this play. But basically what happens is that that defensive end to the top of the screen, who is Tyler Lacey, he slants and now becomes a B-gap player inside of the offensive tackle. And the safety, who is Tanner McAllister again in the nickel, he basically becomes the contained player at that point. He's almost a defensive end in this regard, right? So you're bringing 5 a lot. I noticed that they also like to take the will linebacker, and they'll slant away from wherever the will is, and they'll let him go A or B gap as well. That was Malcolm Rodriguez in their defense. So they like to bring one unoccupied second level defender, whether that is a inside linebacker, whether that is their nickel. They're going to bring pressure. There was
corner.
Play.
They'll bring their corner here.
Yes.
They'll bring their safety from here. They don't do this a lot. They don't bring their third level safety a lot, but if they see something, they will.
You know what they also like to do, Brian, is in that 3 safety look, they'll put Tanner McAllister as the middle of the field safety that we saw, like that 3 safety look.
Right here.
And a lot of times they'll bring him up and they'll just fire him in an A or a B gap
as a run stunt, blitz. Not a blitz.
Yes.
Like not a blitz as far as they're trying to sack the core, but it'll be like a 1st and 10 play where they're just trying to get a different guy into the box. But and so the reason that they'll bring this guy, the reason that they slant to bring him open, it's not to make sure there's not 2 guys coming off the edge. I mean, that's part of it. But the other thing is you're slanting away from that fire because you're trying to get the eyes of the offensive lineman going away from where you're bringing that blitzer, right? So if your left tackle's thinking, oh, this guy's crossing my face, if he looks inside for a second, it's going to be hard for him to then get back outside to a well-timed, and if you have an athletic guy there, a well-timed blitzer. So it really requires great eye discipline and scheme discipline from your offensive tackles in this situation. But then also the same thing is true of your centers and guards, because what they'll do is like they'll slant these 2 guys here. These 2 inside guys will slant to their left, and they'll bring their will and fire him across. Right. And then that safety just comes down to protect him here, which you'll see here. So really impressive stuff, Ryan. Here's another example of that look, against a 3-by-1 with a tight end. We showed this because this is something we expect to see a lot of from Notre Dame. I'll say this too. If your receivers aren't bringing their lunch pail and ready to get after it in the run game, if Ohio State's secondary is anything like Jim Knowles' secondaries at Oklahoma State, it's a street fight in run game. I mean, It is. They will blow your run game up with their secondaries.
Screen game too, man. They'll
because they will smack you. And if you're not ready for it, and Baylor's receivers in this game did a really poor job blocking, in my opinion. Now they got back after them in the Big 12 championship game, but they did not do a good job. And of course, this is Coach Stuckey's unit. I don't think they were prepared for the physicality of the Oklahoma State secondary in this game. They were much more prepared for it in the second game, and which is a game they won. But in this game, they weren't ready for it.
Speaking to the physicality of the secondary too, Brian, in this 3-by-1 look where 3 wide receivers to the top of the screen and a tight end to the bottom of the screen to the short side of the field, a lot of times some coaches will, instead of putting the corner near the tight ends, they'll actually flip the safety in the corner to get the more physical run defender as kind of that alley player. But they don't switch much in Oklahoma State. They're like, our guys are all physical. To be a good defensive back in Jim Knowles' system, you need to be physical and you need to be willing against the run at all times, whether that is cornerback, whether that is safety. So they don't do like the matchup to like, oh, I need a better run defender here. I'm going to put my safety here. They have all the confidence in their nickels and their corners and their safeties to be a plus player in the run game at
No
all
doubt.
times.
Now, they're also going to do a lot of this. They're also going to play a lot of cover one, or it looked at times like they were playing cover two, Ryan, like pre-snap, they'd show cover two, but then somebody would roll. One of the safeties would come down and the other guy would roll. So a lot of cover three to cover, well, more so cover one. Saw a lot of that here. This is against Baylor as well. And this is basically bringing the robber down boundary side. So you're essentially, and this is a 4-4 essentially for all intents and purposes, Ryan. Now, obviously, you're a space 4-4 because you got that nickel out in the slot, but this is basically a 4-4 defense. And they'll do this a lot. And they're going to beat you up at the line of scrimmage. I would be shocked after Jim Knowles watched Notre Dame's receivers last year against Wisconsin, Purdue, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma State, if they don't think we're going to come out early and beat Notre Dame's receivers up, right? Yeah. I mean, we hope that Notre Dame's better prepared for that. But if you're talking about last year's Notre Dame film, I mean, when they tried to play off in the bowl game in the first half, Notre Dame ate them up because they had the reality is, look, why? Notre Dame's receivers were faster than Oklahoma State CBs. I mean, Tanner McAllister, who's at Ohio State now, starting for Ohio State, tried to cover Lorenzo Styles in the first snap, the first drive of the game, and Lorenzo torched him. Braden Lindsey multiple times, just straight ran by Oklahoma State corners, just straight ran by him. Kevin Austin, they couldn't stop. So what they do in the second half, they're going to beat him up at the line of scrimmage, and Notre Dame's receivers, they took away the RPOs with the alignment and then beat them up at the line, and the Notre Dame receivers had a tough time getting free. I'd be shocked if they don't try that against Notre Dame this game. And so I think we will see a lot of this. Now, what they'll do here, Ryan, is the reason I wanted to show this is an example of them just doing it pre-snap. This is how they end up a lot, though. Yeah. But they'll just do it from 2 safeties back, sometimes 3 safeties back, and then guys will rock down post-snap to get to this. But this is still how they end up a lot. And that's why they were really good against the run last year. Now, the key is they trust their corners, number one, to win at the line of scrimmage. And number 2, their thought is we're willing to risk some one-on-ones down the field because we don't think your quarterback's going to have enough time to get the ball down the field. Well, that's something they bank on as well.
And that's key in this look, right? When we're in a cover one situation where, again, cover one, we have 1 safety to the middle of the field and we are man across the board. That is what we're looking at here. The reason that they want to do this and why a defense wants to do it in general is because you want to bring pressure, right? Like when you bring pressure, it is much easier to bring it when you are in a man look comparative to a zone look, because there can be a lot of miscommunication in zone if you're bringing an extra man, if you're bringing a blitz. They are an aggressive defense. Well, they were last year, I should say, where, again, they would bring a Malcolm Rodriguez. They would bring that safety off the slot. They would do those different types of things. But in order to do that consistently, playing man coverage makes a lot of sense. And that's why you see this right here. I mean, they're in press, they're in man coverage, they're man across the board, and they have 1 safety in the middle of the field. So they are gambling, to your point, Brian, a lot of one-on-one opportunities here, but they think that they are obviously going to create the pressure and make enough so that it won't hurt them ultimately.
Right. Because you look last year, Ryan, obviously their ends got a lot of pressure. Brock Martin had 9 sacks last year. Colin Oliver, the freshman, had 10.5 sacks. But the year before, Calvin Bundage, who was a linebacker, led their team in sacks with 7. Yep. Which to Ryan's point, the year before that, Amen Ogbongbemiga, my best shot. It was a linebacker, led their team in sacks. So they will blitz if they don't think they can get pressure on the quarterback. They're going to get pressure on the quarterback some way, somehow. But last year, they had defensive linemen that they trusted to win, and they didn't bring as many blitzes. So that's going to be a fascinating thing, too, is he has shown he will blitz if he needs to heat you up, and he has no problem doing that. Last year was interesting because he didn't blitz as much, in my opinion, at least the 5-6 games I broke down last year getting ready for the bowl game. And then, of course, looking at those again and a couple others this year is, okay, is he going to be more like the 2020 and 2019 defenses, that were more linebacker oriented in regard to their disruption? I mean, you look at like last year, for example, Malcolm Rodriguez had 15 tackles for loss. He was a brilliant player, but 3 of their other top 4 tackle for loss guys, Colin Oliver's 15.5, Brock Martin 14, Tyler Lacey, you pointed out 11.5, were all defensive ends. Well, the year before, their 2 top tackle for loss guys were Trey Sterling, a safety, and Calvin Bundage, a linebacker. 2019, their top 3 tackle for loss guys were DBs, or 2 of them were Malcolm Rodriguez was listed as a safety. He was kind of playing outside a little bit, but their top 3 guys were 2 linebackers and a safety. And so again, that's an example of Jim Knowles saying, hey, we're going to build around what we do, who we have. So the philosophy didn't change, but the emphasis would change, Ryan, based on what he felt about his personnel. He had a lot more faith in his defensive line last year than he did in 20. I mean, you just go watch the film. He didn't have a ton of faith in his defensive line in 19, a little bit more in 2021. So, okay, these cats can get after it. So we're going to let them be more disruptive, which to me is partly why they were so good last year. And that's the thing about Ohio State is, can his defensive line be as good and disruptive as his Oklahoma State defensive line was last year? If it is, then this defense is going to be much, much better. If it isn't, he's going to have to heat people up with pressures, and that's going to expose their secondary to more one-on-one situations. And again, some teams it won't matter because they're going to be better. But that's the hope that Notre Dame is going to have, is like, do they have enough athletes with Mayer and Styles and Lindsey and the running backs to say, hey, look, if you're going to bring pressure because we're picking up your D-line or we're getting movement against the run on you, and you've got to insert more people into the box or insert more people into your pass rush in certain situations, then we have stuff that we can win with. That's going to be a big key for Notre Dame, because Oklahoma State is going to make them beat them on the perimeter. I guarantee that 100%. They're going to make Notre Dame beat them with their perimeter players and be aggressive with their box. That's why I think this right here is why we wanted to show people.
Well, I would say this too, Brian. I don't think, to your point, I don't think it's a coincidence that the best year Jim Knowles had at Oklahoma State was a year where they could win with 4 up front, right? Like where they could get home with those 4, and they don't have to bring extra blitzers. My biggest thing is, as a defensive guy, right? And I think most defensive coordinators would agree with this. I want to be aggressive when I feel like it, right? Yes. Like, I don't want to have to be aggressive because I have to, because I can't create that pressure.
You've heard, I've said this in the past, Ryan. I said, as a defensive, and you're saying the exact same thing differently. This is what Ryan just said, is what you all have heard me say a million times. A defensive coordinator wants to blitz when he wants to, not because he has to. 100%. You're always aggressive, but I don't want to bring numbers unless, because I have to. 100%. I want to bring numbers because I want to. I know I can attack this protection here. I know I can run stunt here. I want to, especially in the pass game. It's a little different in the run game because, you can do run fits and you can get a little bit more aggressive with your run stunts. But when it comes to pass, a team's going to pass, or you're in a passing situation, you don't want to have to bring a lot of pressure, because that's where teams can really hurt you. Because now we have to do this. No, you don't want to. You don't want to do it because you have to. Because now you're exposing yourself, because you're not able to get pressure with your front 4. The other team knows it, and they're going to do more things of leaking things out. Now, and I did find out, so as I was breaking down film last night, I was reminded of, remember the play to Chris Tyree, that the 50-yard touchdown pass? Yeah. I know the exact moment that Tommy Rees said, we're going to run that play. It was against Oklahoma, and they did the same exact blitz, and Oklahoma leaked their back out. Now, they didn't throw to the back. Caleb Williams threw a deep shot, but if he would have looked to his back, it would have been the exact same play. Now, I'm curious how Ohio State's going to handle that. I want to see how he disguises this year. Like, the one thing I didn't think Oklahoma State was great at last year, when they were going to come, you knew they were coming. I mean, they didn't disguise a ton when they walked up. They dropped a guy. They're like, hey, here we come. And knowing the Big 12 was good enough to beat it, Notre Dame was. So what are the adjustments he's going to make there is going to be another interesting aspect of it. And so and he's going to have some linebackers that can run. I mean, look, Steele Chambers can run. Cody Simon can run. Diamante Trainum can run. He's got some guys that can run. And you see Taraja Mitchell's most likely not going to be starting lineup. I think they're going with a little bit of a smaller, linebacking core than they had a couple years ago. Sure. Taraja Mitchell didn't start, I don't think started last year either. But he was a more productive guy 2 years ago, because I think they're going away from the bigger middle linebacker and going more with a speed group, because I think they want to get more athletes on the field.
Which is what they had at Oklahoma State, right? And I think that's also why Ronnie Hickman's going to be playing a lot more towards the line of scrimmage than maybe he did last year. Because I do think Jim Knowles is definitely trying to get more athletic on the second level. I think that's a priority. I mean, Malcolm Rodriguez does not look like your traditional linebacker, Brian, but he was a fantastic football
He
player.
really was. He really was. Great at block destruction, but not only that, but he was great at not getting blocked. And that's going to be a key for these linebackers is how quickly can they get to that point. I mean, there were times, Ryan, where he would just step down and he could just see where the line was coming and just quickly, okay, go right here and just beat him. It's like, how did he beat him there? He's just so quick and his hands were so good.
And I know he was a wrestling background, right, type of thing, but like he was just so strong, man. Like it didn't make any sense for his body type. And there's a reason that he's on the Lions now and he may start this year. So there's a reason for that. And I mean, hats off again to Jim Knowles. That's his guy, right? Like he developed him. And I think that's long term what you can expect of Jim Knowles is to develop good football players in the system. But again, the question is, what is it going to look like in 2022?
That's going to do it for our breakdown of the Ohio State Buckeyes from a first glance standpoint.
Man, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to that little film session segment. Those guys talk so much, man. I just can't. I'm sitting behind the scenes, and me and Brian talked for a couple of minutes, and we're like, man, we're hard to listen to sometimes. But we appreciate you guys for sticking around and listening to us. We had a lot of fun with that. We said that we were going to record for about 45 minutes. We ended up going an hour and 15. So you all know this at this point I see the regulars in here all the time. We could talk a little bit. So appreciate you all. Again, this was a little bit of a first glance look at Ohio State offensively, defensively, what you may see come that game on September 3rd. The rest of the week is going to be more dialed into the Notre Dame side of things as far as what does the Notre Dame program have to do to stop some things that we saw in film, right? We talked about the mesh concept on the offense side of the football. We talked about Jim Knowles' defense. What do they best have to do in order to capitalize on their potential advantages or create some mismatches in their own right? So that's what we'll be doing over the next couple of days. And that is going to be really telling, I think, leading up to the Friday show where we'll do a little bit of let's do some predictions. And that's not only just Notre Dame, Ohio State game. Of course, that's the centric to this show, but we'll also be talking about a few other of the great matchups this weekend because it's a pretty nice week one matchup of football. So that is going to do it for this section of the podcast. But do not go anywhere because next up, we'll be diving into the mailbag. I recorded a ton of questions already, started them up. We have 18 questions. So out there, if you want to start pumping more questions in to the chat, I will stay here as long as I need to make sure everyone's question is answered. But that will do it for this section of the Irish Breakdown podcast. And now it's time to get into the mailbag and appreciate all the positive feedback and notes in the chat about the breakdown. Again, my biggest joy with it is that me and Brian genuinely just had a good time doing it, right? And I'm glad that you all enjoyed it or got something out of it or whatever your vantage point is on it. But we appreciate the positive feedback as always. Before we start the mailbag, if you could like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell. If you're listening on a podcast also, Apple Podcast 5-star rating, we really appreciate it. Tell them how much Ryan held it down today and how much you love him. So, gets on the big guy's good side. You know what I'm saying? So appreciate you all, but let's get into the mailbag here today. So we had Travis that dropped in a super chat before we actually started the film. Question, what do you and I would love if people wanted to answer this in the chat too, because I think that this is a very interesting topic. His question is, what do you think Tyler Buchner's stat line needs to be for Notre Dame to win? So Travis, first and foremost, thank you so much for the super chat. We have discussed this a ton. I think the thing for me, if Notre Dame has a legitimate chance to win this football game against a great offense in Ohio State and what's been a very good football team over the last few years and good coaching staff, and it's going to be a test for Notre Dame, there's no doubt. But I think that if they have a chance to win the football game, their best chance is to be a balanced attack, right? I don't think that that's just a Tyler Buchner thing, right? Like, I think that I need to see what is also going around him, right? How much is the offensive line improved? Do they get the running game going outside of Tyler Buchner's impact in the running game? Are the wide receivers maybe making a assertive effort to take advantage of maybe the advantages that they have in the passing games. We've talked about some of the struggles that Ohio State's secondary has had, specifically last year. So I don't know if I want to put an actual number on it, Travis. I'll say this, though. I'll say I think it needs to be balanced, right? So I think regardless, he needs an impact, not only as a runner, because we know that Tyler Buckner could do that. I think that he has an easy impact in that regard, but also he needs to be a consistent passer in the passing game. And I think more than anything, though, Notre Dame can't kill themselves offensively. They need to be an on schedule and aggressive side of the football, but they can't turn the football over, right? I think that that's the biggest thing, because Ohio State's going to score, guys. Like, I hate to break it to everyone out there, like, they're going to score some, and Notre Dame can't limit their amount of possessions, right? And limiting their amount of possessions is 3 and outs, turnovers. I think you need to have a semblance of efficiency on the offensive side of the football. So I'll say, just for the argument's sake, because I don't like to have cop-outs, 200 plus passing yards, and I think he needs to have a decent amount on the ground too. I don't think he needs to have 100 plus necessarily to win this football game, but I think his impact needs to be felt, because that's going to loosen the box a little bit. That's going to get the other running backs going. I think that we know we need to continue to stay on schedule and not turn the football over. Do not kill yourselves, right? Because you're playing a good football team, obviously. So don't kill yourselves. You need to be able to keep yourself on schedule and be an efficient, explosive offense. The next question is from Christopher Crosby. Ryan, why is everyone so worried about our secondary? I get Clarence Lewis had a rough bowl game, but there is a good talent back there. Am I crazy for having more faith in them than most? I don't think you're crazy, Christopher. I'll say this. It's a combination thing, right? One, Notre Dame's secondary wasn't consistent. I mean, it's not even just Clarence Lewis part of everything. Like, Cam Hart needs to get better. Brandon Joseph's a new member of the secondary. The other safety position, whether it is DJ Brown, Houston Griffith, whoever playing the majority of the reps or just splitting the reps entirely, it needs to be more consistent. There's no doubt. Coupling that with the fact that Clarence Lewis had some struggles at points last year. And like, the Oklahoma State game is an easy game to look at because number 6 had a tough day. Like, let's call it what it is. But you're also coupling that with the simple fact that, like, hey, they're also playing against a great passing offense in Ohio State, a great offense in general, but like, just for a opposition to opposition comparison, we're talking about the secondary and what is perceived. And I think it has a lot to do with the passing game and the weapons that Ohio State has. You know, like Jackson Smith-Njigba is an All-American. He's a great football player. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is incredibly talented. And Emeka Ogbuka is a very talented player. Julian Fleming was a 5-star once upon a time. Cameron Babb has gotten just kind of thrown at the bottom of the depth chart, but like, he was also a high 4-star caliber player. So there's a lot of weapons. There's a lot of talent. And then you have, of course, CJ Stroud as the signal caller, right? Who is a Heisman finalist, potential first-round pick. So I get it. I understand completely why people are pushing back against, like, well, not pushing back against, why the perception is out there that Notre Dame is going to struggle in the secondary. I do think it's going to be a little better than what is perceived, but Christopher, I'd be lying if I said that, like, the Notre Dame secondary is just going to lock stuff down. Like, that's not going to happen, right? Like, Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to get his. The other receivers are going to get theirs. It's about limiting the impact, right? Jackson Smith-Njigba, if he has 10 catches, it can't be for 180 yards. It's got to be 10 for 110. You know what I mean? Like, it's, and I saw somebody say in the chat earlier, limiting the impact is when you get when these players in space, talking about manufacturing space so much, tackling immediately, right? Make it an 8-yard gain instead of a 18-yard gain, right? Like, limiting that impact, tackling is going to be a big emphasis in this game because Notre Dame has speed on the field defensively. They are going up against a team, though, that lives in space and they manipulate space as well as any team in college football. So you're going to have to tackle well in the open field. You're going to have to. If you can, then I think Notre Dame has a chance to stay in this game and they have a chance to win this game. But if you don't, and Ohio State is able to just rip off big play after big play because they're able to break tackles in space, then you're in a little bit of trouble. That's all it is. So, but to your question specifically, Christopher, I don't think you're crazy because I do think Notre Dame's secondary is going to be better than people give it credit for. But you have to understand that, like, they are playing a great wide receiver group, right? A great quarterback. It's understandable why the perception is out there. But in order to erase a perception, you have to go out and have action, right? So I think Notre Dame has a chance to prove some doubters wrong. And not doubters wrong as in, again, they're not going to go into the shoot and shut down these wide receivers for 4 quarters. They're going to get theirs. But limiting impact is the biggest thing for me. I keep saying that. Limit impact, limit impact. Don't allow explosive plays. You're going to get some catches. Don't allow things to just kind of get open off to the races. I think that's the limiting impact for me. All right, we had Chris Basker, who said, who do you see having the best game for Notre Dame versus Ohio State? So it's I there's a couple ways I can take this, Chris. Right, one, it's the best on both sides of the football. I think that I'm going to work it from an advantageous standpoint, right? Like, what is the most important player, maybe potentially on both sides of the football? And we'll talk about this more this week because we'll talk about players that we think need to have big games and X factors and step up and all that good stuff, right? But I think for me, maybe not singling out even a single player, but I think that the front four of Notre Dame is very vital defensively in this game because I want Notre Dame to be able to create pressure without bringing a ton of extra players because, again, passing game is fantastic, a lot of weapons. I don't want to sacrifice extra players in coverage because I have to manufacture pressure. I want them to be able to get home by themselves. So Isaiah Foskey is an easy one, right? I think that he has the opportunity to have a big game, but you need the entire defensive line, I think, to show up and show out in this situation. Because Ohio State does have advantages at wide receiver versus the quarterback in a vacuum. Because, hate to break it to everyone again, Ohio State has advantages wide receiver wise versus cornerback wise or secondary wise about pretty much everyone in the country. I don't know if there's any secondary in the country that I'd be like, oh, they have a clear advantage over Ohio State. Ohio State is developing wide receivers as good as anyone in recent memory. They had 2 first-round picks last year. We're going to have another one most likely this year. And that's not even counting the young guns like Emeka and Marvin Harrison Jr., right? So they are fantastic football players. So for me, Notre Dame needs to create pressure on CJ Stroud. They need to get there with 4. I need Riley Mills to have a big game. I need Jason Adamalola to have a show-out game. I need Justin Adamalola. I need Howard Cross. I need Jacob Lacey, Alexander Ahrensberger when he gets there. They need to come to play on the defensive front for Notre Dame. Create pressure. Rattle CJ if you can early on in the game. Make him make a couple mistakes. And that's not mistakes as in turnovers, right? It'd be nice, sure. But maybe holding the ball in a rough spot and taking a bad sack. Maybe it is reading coverage a little too quickly and he throws to the wrong receiver. Or maybe he has his pass batted down at the line. Whatever it might be, you have to affect the passer. That's the biggest thing for me, right? Because I think so. We had a question about who's going to cover Jackson Smith and Jigba all night, and I'll get to that question here in a little bit. But the fact of the matter is even if it's Cam Hart, your best corner by a landslide, and Cam Hart, I think, is a fantastic football player, he's not going to win every rep against Jackson Smith and Jigba. Like, it's just not going to happen, right? So, but if you're able to affect CJ Stroud, I think that gives you a pretty good opportunity. That works inside and out, right? It can't just be Foskey. It just can't be Mills. You got to get Jason Adamalola got to have a game. Some of these interior players have to create pressure. They need to come to play on the defensive side of the football for this to be an optimal amount of ability to win this football game. That needs to happen, in my opinion. And I also think that on the offensive side of the football, I don't want to put everything on a first-year starting quarterback, true sophomore, was in a gadgety role last year as a first-year signal caller. But Tyler Buckner has to have a big game, man. He does. I mean, I'm look, Tyler Buckner, if I'll put it like this. Chris Tyree has the ability to affect the game in the run and the pass game. Not a high-volume guy, though, right? Lorenzo Styles has the ability to have a big game, I think. Michael Mayer, of course, he's a star. Tyler Buckner, though, can have the biggest impact on this game from a throwing perspective and from a running perspective. He can do things in the run and pass game that Notre Dame hasn't had in a few years, if we're being completely honest, right? So if he's able to tap into just a lot of his potential, I think that Tyler Buckner could be the big difference between potential victory and maybe a defeat. Like, I think that he has that type of upside to him. The dual threat capabilities are endless with him. So get the run game going earlier, get the read game going earlier, get him comfortable and let him loose. That's what I want to see with Tyler Buchner. So I think it's Tyler Buchner on offense, Chris, hopefully. And this is me with the homer hat on for a second, right? In a optimal world where Notre Dame can pull out a victory, I think that it is the defensive line and it is Tyler Buchner that are going to be the main points of emphasis for potential victory. But we shall see very soon. But appreciate the question, Chris. I'm going to go to Easy Money Gamblers. Do you think Notre Dame's offense will look like the 2017 version with big emphasis on the running game? I think it'll look more like the 2017 version. Yeah, because I think that there's going to be more concepts that you've seen in the past under Harry Heastan. I think there's going to be a nice combination of inside zone, outside zone, but it's also some pin and pull stuff, be able to get to the perimeter and utilize the read game off of the inside zone. That's going to be huge. And I mean, 2017, you talk about a guy like Brandon Wimbush, right? Who, although very inconsistent as a passer and eventually was his downfall, dynamic athlete. There's no question about that, right? Tyler Buchner is that same type of athlete. So I think that there is going to be a heavy emphasis on the run game. But I think that the difference is that I think this version may have more opportunity to create explosive plays, right? Because I think that Tyler Buchner is a more efficient passer than a Brandon Wimbush was, especially at that point in his career. I think that you have guys like Braden Lindsey, 4.4 flat 40 type of guy, a Lorenzo Styles, Michael Mayer, big passing target to eventually work the seams. I think you can create some explosive plays, not even counting what you have with guys like Chris Tyree in the run game as well. So I want to see efficiency, but more than anything to this question, I think that Notre Dame could even be definitely can be a more efficient offense because Tyler Buchner's a more efficient passer, but also create the explosive plays that 2017 was able to create. I think you have the stable of running backs. I think you have the pass catchers. I think you have a dynamic quarterback. It's all about the maturation because they are still young. I mean, they are. 2 sophomore offensive tackles are the guys that we're excited about. A couple sophomore running backs are the guys that we're excited about. Lorenzo Styles Jr. is a sophomore. We got Deion Coles, he's a sophomore. Jane Thomas is a sophomore. There's a lot of sophomores in this offense. So you're hoping for big breakouts, but if they can get anywhere near what you expect them to be, then I think that it can be a similar version, but an even more efficient version of 2017. That's what I think. We have Eric Pruitt's question in the chat. Does the Ohio State offense have the chance to be like the LSU 2019 offense? Eric, I would normally not even go there because I'll say this, right? 2019 was the greatest offense I've ever seen. It is. Joe Burrow and Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Thaddeus Moss was a good football player for them last year. Terrace Marshall Jr. was banged up a little bit during that season, but like even him had a great impact for when he played. So comparing them, I mean, that's high regards, man. And I mean, Joe Burrow threw 60 touchdowns that year and ended up being the first overall pick because of the big season that he had. And you have so many future first round picks on that team as far as the pass catchers, and even Clyde Edwards-Helaire went in the first round that year as well to the Kansas City Chiefs. So it's a tough one, man. I think that it can be comparable though, right? Like I don't think it's going to be quite to that level because that's a generational type of offense in my opinion. But I mean, Ohio State last year averaged about 46 points a game. I think that year someone put in the chat was around like 48 point something. So they're not far off. It's just, I think you magnify the 2019 LSU class offense because not only was it great, they also won a championship, right? And that's we kind of want to separate team success from like just overall production sometimes. But I mean, it does add to the lore, right? I mean, it's like that team was great and they had a great offense, and that's what buoyed them a ton because LSU's defense was solid but unspectacular that year. Like it was a good, solid defense. It wasn't great, it wasn't bad. But it definitely wasn't a typical LSU offense. But I think that when you're looking at defense, but you're talking about what that offense was, I mean, it was historic. I think Ohio State could be great and close to that level, but just not ready to say generational, right? Like that's tough. It's tough to get there. We had another super chat from David Carpenter. Assuming all other positions groups do okay, what's one position on both sides of the football that need to dominate for Notre Dame to win on Saturday? It's a great question. I think for me, David, I think I originally said just offensive line, defensive line. I'm still there in the sense that, like, I think Notre Dame has the clearest advantages at those positions comparative to where Ohio State has advantages. But I think, or I should rephrase that. I think that's where Notre Dame potentially has an advantage. Okay, sorry, that was phrased very poorly on my part. So I think offensive and defensive line are most important. I think that for me, though, I need the pass catchers to create some explosive plays. That's what I need out of this game if Notre Dame is going to be super successful. That is a position that I will be watching closely to see if Lorenzo Styles can create some chunk plays. Braden Lindsey can create some chunk plays. Michael Mayer can create a couple big plays down the seam. Those guys, I think, need to create some explosive plays because, again, I think it's going to be an efficient offense because I think they're going to run the football better. The offensive line is going to be better. I think they're going to have some longer drives, but I think they really, I need them to. Sorry, I was just reading a comment that is just asinine. But I think for Notre Dame to have a clear advantage there, I need that the skill position players to create some explosive plays. Like, I need that to happen. Defensively, I think it's the second level. There is some concern for me at linebacker. I think Maris Loifow is going to be a big breakout, but he's a guy that doesn't have a ton of experience. He had 20-something tackles 2 years ago, and then he got injured last year, right? Like, we haven't seen a ton of Maris Loifow. JD Bertrand's a good football player, but you don't really want him playing in a increased amount of space, right? Jack Kaiser played solid but unspectacular football, in my opinion, last year. So I think the second level needs to be better. Why? One, because Notre Dame needs to stop the run. Trayvon Henderson's a great football player, right? We need to stop him. Number two, if you watched the video earlier, we're talking about like mesh and crossers and creating space. The way to stop that space is to have athletic and efficient players on the second level to close throwing windows, to contact and redirect players working in those crossing routes and stopping the run. So I think the linebackers are going to be vital, and I think the pass catchers need to create explosive plays. That can come from a yak perspective, yards after catch, or that can come from a vertical perspective. Notre Dame needs to play that type of brand for me to efficient but yet explosive to win this football game. But David, it's a great question, and thank you again for the super chat. I really do appreciate it. All right, we have one from Travis B. Ryan. Just Ryan, unfortunately. Sorry, Travis. Would you rather play Ohio State first and Clemson late in the season, or vice versa? I would rather play Ohio State first and Clemson's later. I know Clemson's breaking in a new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator, comparative to Ohio State just breaking in a new defensive coordinator. But we talked about the Jim Knowles thing, right? There is some struggle early on in seasons at times, or in just the initial season, with Jim Knowles playing efficient football in the first season under Jim Knowles. Sorry, I'm navigating its chat, getting texts, and talking. So my apologies. I can't chew and walk like Brian says at the same time, but we're here. So I think that for me, I want to get Ohio State in game one if I'm Notre Dame, because I think there's going to be an adjustment period on the defensive side of the football and on the offensive line, because there's guys that are moving around and there's a new offensive line coach. So I think that getting them earlier is more advantageous for Notre Dame. Clemson, I mean, you could say they might have it figured out at that point, but like, I don't know. Everything I just saw DJ Uiagalelei last year, I don't feel optimistic that he's going to get a massive turnaround, but we'll see. But either way, it doesn't change my answer. Whether he is a great player or he's just an average player, below average player, whatever. I think personally that I would still rather have Ohio State game one, because I think Ohio State's going to be a better football team this year. And I would rather try to take advantage of their transition period rather than Clemson's. So hope that makes sense. I'm going to pull up one that just went in the chat because I just disagree with it so much. Chuck Simon says Ohio State's O-line rated number 1 in college football. Notre Dame has no advantage there. Chuck, I saw the magazine where that was rated. Okay, I did. and this is all due respect. I swear, I'm not doing this to throw shade or anything, because I've been following you along with you in the chat, and you've been very respectful, sir. I know you're just excited, Ohio State fan. Cool. I'm glad you're here. I really am. What about Ohio State gives them the claim to the number one offensive line in the nation? Is it the fact that they just lost their starting left tackle and they're transitioning a very talented player, Paris Johnson, no doubt, but you're pushing him over to the left side. So game one, you're talking about a guy that's making a transition there, right? Matthew Jones started 2 football games last year, and he played some, sure, rotated in with Paris Johnson Jr. at guard position. Cool. But is he a great player? Center's a good player. I like Luke Whippler. He's a good player, good solid football player. Donovan Jackson, who I know is a really talented player that a lot of people are really excited about in Ohio State land. So, like, I'm looking forward to seeing him play. Really am, because remember him as a recruit a little bit, and who's a dog. And I look forward to seeing him. But he's never he's never started a football game for Ohio State. I think he played in 13 games last year. I don't know how extensively, like what the stat count was, but he's a projection right now, right? Like, he's a projection. 2 out of 4 of the guys I'm talking about are pure projections right now. You haven't seen Paris Johnson Jr. play left tackle. And Donovan Jackson has never started a football game. That's projection. And then the DeJuan Jones thing, I know I saw someone in the chat say he's lost like 30 pounds this year. I've heard the same. I look forward to seeing him in better shape, but based on the film that I watch, and not just for this show, but also from a NFL draft perspective, DeJuan Jones wasn't very good last year. I know his PFF grade was okay, but like, he's very heavy-footed, man, and he's not very flexible, and he has no sink in his hips. So I think that Isaiah Foskey has an advantage over him. I do. I think it's a clear advantage. So I think Notre Dame's defensive line is better right now than Ohio State's offensive line. Could I be proven wrong? Sure. And if I am Chuck, I will come back on the show and I will say, you know what? Chuck was right. That offensive line was a lot better than I was giving it credit for, but I think there's a lot of question marks with it right now. Like, I think there's a lot of projection. I'm cool. Like, again, after the season, I will, come back on the word and say, like, I was completely wrong, but I just, right now, I don't think it's much. And Archer, I wanted to pull yours up because it's a fair point. Archer says, to be fair, Ryan, how much projection is being used for Notre Dame's line? Fisher played 2 games all year. The guard play last year wasn't great either. Archer, not arguing with you. I'm not. I am projecting to say that I think they could have an advantage up front. So I'll be there. Sure. And if Chuck is using the same thing that I'm doing, then I'm good with it, man. I'm good with it. But all I'll say is the play that I saw from Joe Alt was definitely better than what I saw from DeJuan Jones last year. Just my opinion. Okay. And you have a lot of experience back. You don't have a lot of experience with Paris Johnson playing the left tackle position. And you also don't have a lot of experience with Donovan Jackson. Although I like Donovan Jackson. Again, as a recruit, I liked him. I hope he's a good football player. So it's a fair criticism, Archer. And again, we'll have a recap show. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I do think Notre Dame has an advantage in the offensive and defensive lines. I do. But we'll see what happens. Luckily, Saturday, we'll find out very quickly. Very, very quickly. Great question, though. Right. I'm going to pull up Christopher Crosby. Christopher said, and again, this chat's more, it doesn't have to just be Notre Dame, Ohio State centric. We can get some recurring questions in here, talk some college football. If you want to ask me what my favorite food is, like, let's do it. I have not watched Top Gun Maverick. We covered that at the beginning of the show, just so everybody knows. Ryan, everyone is talking about, this is from Christopher Crosby. Ryan, everyone is talking about Peyton Bowen all the time and for good reason. But where does Notre Dame stand with little brother Eli? At worst, I think he would be an elite slot defender. So, Christopher, I agree with you. I think he could be a really good slot defender. No doubt about it, right? There's no doubt about it. He's a player where he actually looked a little taller than me, to be honest. I think he was around 5'9" last year. I would say he's closer to 5'10" this year. And I don't think you can just underrate the instincts and the feel for the game that this kid has. I mean, he's got quickness to him too, and he's a good all-around athlete, no doubt. But I think the best thing about Eli Bowen's game for me is that he's just so smart, man. Like, even the catch that he gave up this past game and he's able to just kind of pull the ball out at the end, I'm like, that's a crafty move, man. And it takes some guts to do it for one, but I think he's a really good football player. Where do they stand? Where does he stand with Notre Dame? Notre Dame likes him a lot. They do. I think that he would be a take for Notre Dame right now. He is working through the process. I've talked to him pretty recently, and I mean, he's saying all the right things. I don't think he's in a rush, right? Like Peyton committed relatively early. He was in January, right after his junior year. I think that Eli's going to go even past that. Like, I think he's more like a spring, summer decision before the senior year type of player. But we'll see. I think they're in a solid spot right now, but more work to be done, obviously. So, but they're in a decent spot with Eli Bowen. It's just about the process needs to play out a little bit. We got a super chat from Sammy Young. Would the spread with Ohio State be different if we would have won our bowl game? That's an interesting question, Sammy. I will say this. I do think that halted immediate momentum for a second, right? I think if Notre Dame wins that football game and potentially wins it convincingly, they're probably looked a little different because it would have been a big win just in the sense of Oklahoma State was a good football team last year, was on a big stage. They held a dominating win at dominating points during the game. And if they were able to finish that one off, I think it might be a little bit lower, but I don't think it would be gigantic because although Oklahoma State was a good team last year, they're not Ohio State, right? And these are the games that Notre Dame has struggled with, right? Like the Ohio States, the Clemsons, the Alabamas, the elite teams, right? So a win against Oklahoma State may have dropped it a couple points, but I still think it would have been a really big line to start at least, right? And my biggest surprise is that it's continued to grow. I mean, I've seen a couple of sports books where it's up to like 17 and a half, 18 points, and we'll see what the final number is, but I think it would have been still in the same ballpark, though. I don't think it would have been like crazy, as far as like 17 and a half, maybe more like 14 and a half, 15. But I still think it would have been pretty substantial because until the Notre Dame beats an elite football team, not just a really good one, there's going to be question marks. So maybe slightly different, but still in the same ballpark, in my opinion. But Sammy, thank you again for the super chat. Really appreciate it. All right, we're going to go to Blaine Tiller here. Ryan, all things being equal, do you think this game being the early favorites to the offense or the defense more? Both teams have new DCs, returning OCs, etc. I think that the advantage goes to the offense early on for Notre Dame. If we're talking about just the offense versus Ohio State's defense or the Notre Dame defense versus the Ohio State offense, I would say that Notre Dame's offense has more of an advantage because I think that, let's just look at the facts of it, right? We expect Notre Dame's offense to be better. Ohio State's defense wasn't great last year, and they're breaking in a new defensive system. So when you're comparing it to the other side of football, Notre Dame's defense was pretty good last year. Could be better. I think it will be better. But you're also going against an Ohio State offense that returns a lot, right? It's going to be receivers everywhere, running back, Heisman finalist at quarterback. Like it's a really, really good offense coming back, and Ryan Day still calling the plays. So I think that it is definitely, for me, the separator is expect Notre Dame's offense to be better and the defensive turnover on Ohio State's side of things. So I would definitely say, Blaine, that I think Notre Dame's offense is in a better spot than Notre Dame's defense coming into this game as it stands right now. All right, we had C-Mac who wanted to ask, how much leash does Freeman and Golden going to have with DBs before they turn to Freeman's freshman corners? The freshman corners, of course, are Jaden Mickey and Benjamin Morrison, who we know our good friend Brian Driscoll is a big fan of Benjamin Morrison. So they're both in the 3 deep at both spots. Jaden Mickey, I think that Jaden Mickey has a good opportunity to get some playing time in this game. C-Mac, substantial, might be pushing it a little bit, but like during the course of the season, though, I think that he is going to play a lot of football. And I don't think that's really a thing with a short leash, though. Like he's just played good football, right? And I don't think it's a fault of Clarence Lewis that Jaden Mickey's playing really good football. And from what we hear, Benjamin Morrison is really turning it on in fall camp as well. So I think both players are going to play regardless of how short the leash is. But I think the fact that both players have come in, Jaden Mickey in the spring and the fall, and Benjamin Morrison in the fall, and competed the way they have, I think that, again, I wouldn't call it a short leash. I would just say that those guys have maximized their opportunities, right? So unless Clarence Lewis and whoever, Cam Hart or whoever just goes out there and just has a putrid showing in the first half or 3/4, whatever it is, I don't think there's going to be like a crazy change during game one. It's just more, I think the freshman cornerbacks are too good to keep off the field. Right. We had a question from Dave Country Boy. A lot of great questions today, by the way. How does Notre Dame linebackers stack up against Ohio State's linebackers against the run? So, Dave, this is so tough to tell you, to be honest, because just from Notre Dame's perspective, like, okay, JD Bertrand was a good player against the run last year. He missed some tackles in space a little bit, but for the most part, I mean, coming downhill, he had a pretty good year. He had 100-something tackles. He was a good football player last year. It is a complete projection on what Maris Loifau is. Everybody knows that I'm the biggest Maris Loifau fan on this podcast. I know that Brian is followed closely behind, in my opinion, but it is a projection of how good of a run defender he's going to be. Just how good of a player is he going to be? So last time we saw him, he was a 20-something tackle guy, in 2020. And I mean, he had flashes, but I don't know what he is right now. I think I know what he can be, but right now it is all projection. Jack Kaiser, good yet unspectacular. He needs to play better football. It's a funny comparison, though, because it's probably Ohio State's biggest question mark, too, defensively, right? I mean, you have Steele Chambers, who I thought played some decent football at spurts, especially for a guy that was a running back turned linebacker pretty late. And I mean, he's a very good athlete. And I like Steele Chambers, actually. I've talked to Brian a little bit about this. I think that he can have a big jump up this year, because I think that he's full year, as starting linebacker now, and he's had a full off season to hone his craft and do all that good stuff. So I like him, man. I like him. I like Chambers a ton. I think he could play. I think he could be a good football player. I'm not as thrilled about Tommy Eichenberg, and we had a question about Tommy Eichenberg, who is the younger brother of Liam. And he actually led all linebackers last year for Ohio State in tackles. I think he had 60-something total tackles and like 6.5 tackles for loss. He's fine, but I don't think he's a great football player, right? Like he's a good, solid football player, but I think you can be better in that spot, right? So there's question marks there. So I would say that there's, I don't even want to say higher upside. I'm just going to say this, Dave. I don't think that it's a fair question to answer right now, because I just think there's too much projection, and I have to see what Maris Loifau is. If Maris Loifau is the player that I think he can be, then I think it's Notre Dame. I think it is, because you have good, solid football player, at least in a JD Bertrand. If he's just what he was last year, he's a good football player. But if he is a player that takes a step up, and Maris Loifau is what I think he is, then I think it's a runaway, if I'm being honest. But that's very dependent on a little bit of projection. So right now, I would say it's kind of up in the air. All right. Ryan Loftus. What's up, Ryan? What's up, IB Nation? What's up, Notre Dame Nation? What's up, Ryan? Just getting through a little bit of the mailbag, my friend. Thank you for hopping in here, as always. Some good conversations in the chat as well. Thank you all. Really appreciate that as well. We're going to move on to Kyle Berry's question. Back to Ohio State. Does the 4-2-5 defense give Tommy an opportunity to hit a bunch of shallow crossing routes and make their linebackers guard our quick wide receivers in space, or do the safeties take those routes? So, Kyle, we'll talk a little more about how Notre Dame can take advantage of the 4-2-5 during a show this week. We'll talk a little bit more about scheme, but to keep it as simple as possible, how the 4-2-5 function is basically you want a lot of speed on the second level. That's why you have that nickel rover type that in Ohio State's defense is going to be Tanner McAllister, and then you have a guy like a Steele Chambers at will, and then you have Tommy Eichenberg and Mike. In theory, you want to get a lot of speed on the second level. So crossing routes, I think it's kind of a misnomer that crossing routes are to take advantage of speed. Honestly, it is to take advantage of bad eyes and the ability to work in space. So even though Steele Chambers is very athletic, even though Tanner McAllister's played a lot of football and is a good athlete and more of a nickel type than a linebacker rover type, he's still a guy that I think can be taken advantage of a little bit. But we'll get more into there kind of during the rest of the week's breakdowns. But I do think there is some advantages that you can take in the short to intermediate passing game as far as the shallow crossers and that type of thing. But I also think that there's definitely areas where you can threaten some vertical concepts, right? Like if you get enough time to throw the football, I think Notre Dame can have some success creating explosive plays. But again, we'll break more of that down the rest of this week. We are not Marshall. Ryan, how will Knowles manufacture pressure on the quarterback when his D-line is stood up? So I'm not 100% sure what you mean by when the D-line is stood up. You mean, I guess, stalemate at the point of attack? I look, I'll say this about manufacturing pressure just in general in Jim Knowles' defense. When you see them playing a lot of single high, so a lot of one safety looks, I think that's when you're going to see them trying to manufacture a little pressure from a blitz perspective. I watched 4 or 5 games last night, and the Baylor game was the one that I really honed in on the most because I thought there was a lot of good examples of 3 down, 4 down, single high, 2 high, a lot of different looks that Baylor actually threw a lot at them offensively in that game. And Oklahoma State, you saw a lot of adjustments during that game, right? So you're going to see a lot of movement up front. You're going to see a lot of late blitzers, free rushers. But at the core of it, for me, we are in our Marshall. I think that Jim Knowles doesn't want to manufacture pressure. Like they were so successful last year because they had 4 really good defensive linemen that they could get home with. Colin Oliver had 10.5 sacks. Brock Martin had like 9 or 9.5, right? Like they were able to get pressure without simulating pressure, without manufacturing it. So, I think there's going to be moments where you see Steel Chambers on a blitz off of a slant look up front. I think there's going to be times where Tanner McAllister blitzes off the slot. They're going to bring pressure from certain spots. But I think for the most part, if they're able to get home with 4, then that's how Jim Knowles is going to win, right? Like that's how he wants to win. He wants Zach Harrison and JT and Jack Sawyer. He wants them to feast more than not because that gives them more options in the back end, if we're being honest. So we shall see, though. We shall see. It's a great question, though. And if you weren't here for the beginning part, we did talk about manufacturing pressure a little bit. So make sure you go back to the top of that video if you haven't. I'm going to work through a few more of these questions a little quicker because there's still a lot left, man. This is harder when I'm talking about myself. Ryan, We Are Marshall also said, Ryan, what types of confusion will Knowles throw at Buckner? Will he put 7 in the box to stop the run and then drop 3 into coverage? I think that early on, there's going to be an emphasis to stop the run for Jim Knowles and the Ohio State defense. I think there is. If Notre Dame is able to create a few explosive plays, a few chunk plays, then I think he's going to try to confuse Tyler Buckner by mixing up coverages. I think that you're not just going to see man across the board, single high. You're going to see some 2 high looks. I think you're going to see some match quarters. I think you're going to see a lot of different things to try to confuse Tyler Buckner. I think the best way to confuse a young quarterback is not really the pressure side of things. Like creating pressure on any quarterback is a great thing. But I think it's showing him different looks from a coverage perspective pre to post snap. I think that's where you can confuse some people. We had a question from Blaine Tiller. Was looking at the Ohio State depth chart. Am I seeing this correct that their starting Mike linebacker is Liam Eichenberg's little brother? Yes, Tommy Eichenberg. He is their starting middle linebacker. And Blaine, he was also the leading tackler for the linebacker unit last year. Their leading tackler overall was Ronnie Hickman, who plays safety. But for the linebackers, Tommy Eichenberg was their leading tackler last year. Yep, Liam's younger brother. Brian Denbo, does Notre Dame have dudes to combat these looks? I'm assuming that we're talking about the mesh that we talked about. We also talked about the curl flat concepts and the work off of there from a 3 wide receiver alignment. So do they have the dudes to combat these looks? I think Notre Dame has players that can make things difficult for Ohio State. Do they have the dudes to stop them all the time? No. And nobody else in the country really does either, if we're being honest, right? Like these Ohio State wide receivers, running backs, skill position players will give any team problems. There's no doubt. That's why you need to win in other areas. Notre Dame's defensive line, I think, needs to create a lot of pressure. And your dudes need to be dudes that day. Like make no mistake about it. If Maris Loifau's a dude, he needs to assert himself on that day. Cam Hart needs to be a dude that day. Brandon Joseph needs to be a dude that day. They all need to be dudes. So I think that they can make enough plays. Are they going to completely stop them? No, I don't think so. But it's about limiting impact. Continue to limit the impact. We had, sorry, I skipped over a question that I wanted to hit. Tommy, Ryan, have you seen the NCAA 14 simulation of the game? If so, what's your opinion on how that one played out? I haven't seen it, Tommy. If you want to DM me on Twitter, please send that my way. I have not seen it. I'm assuming it's just on YouTube somewhere or on Twitter, but please send it my way. I have not seen that one yet, though, but I would love to take a look because those things are fun usually. Some are very unrealistic, but I would love to see it. Darius Martin, our favorite Alabama fan in the crowd. Ryan, how many rushing yards do you think Notre Dame will need to win the game? And do you think Notre Dame give up 350 plus? 350 plus what? Rushing yards? I don't think Notre Dame's going to give up 350 plus rushing yards. How many rushing yards? Excuse me. How many rushing yards do they need to win? Like, I don't know if there's a number on it, man. Like, I think they need to run the football well. So I think they're 200 plus rushing yards, right? Like 180 is getting to the area where like it's becoming a little more questionable. But if you're 180 plus, 200 plus, I think you have a shot. Notre Dame definitely needs to run the football with efficiency, though. They cannot have a game like Oklahoma State in the bowl game, right, where they can't run the football and they just have to air it out every play. Like, that's not an advantageous way to beat the Ohio State Buckeyes. They need to be able to run the football. There's no doubt about it. Couple more here before we get out of here. Pat McMahon, can Notre Dame get pressure with only 4? Do we need to bring more numbers to get it done? Pat, I talked about this a little bit, but in order for Notre Dame to be the best version of themselves, I think they need to get pressure with 4. Like, we're talking about these passing game weapons. I don't want to sacrifice pass coverage just to create pressure because I have to, right? Like, I want that to be a thing where if I'm mixing in pressure a ton, it's because I see an advantage and I want to take advantage of it, right? I want it to be out of my advantage, not out of my desperation, if that makes sense. So I think Notre Dame needs to get home with 4. Like, I've talked about it. Like, Paris Johnson Jr. is starting his first football game at left tackle. DeJuan Jones, I thought, was very inconsistent last year at right tackle. Isaiah Foskey needs to win, man. Like, they do. You have guys where Donovan Jackson starting his first football game at Ohio State. Matthew Jones has played sporadically, and I think he played like 400 snaps last year, but he was kind of a more of a reserve type that played a lot of football. So I think you need to take advantage. Jason Amalola needs to show up, man. Like, the defensive line is going to be very important. If you can create pressure with 4, then you're going to be in a good spot. If you can't, then you're in a little bit of trouble. But again, we'll see what happens soon. But I do think getting pressure with 4 is going to be very important. I don't want to have to blitz a ton if I'm not able to create pressure. It's not a good situation to be in. Right. I think we have a couple more. I'll hit this one for Ladarius real quick. Ladarius said, what type of D does Notre Dame play? 3-4, 4-3, 3-3-5. So, Ladarius, last year they were between a 4-man front and a 3-man front. You would see some 3-3-5 looks. You would see some 4-2-5 looks. I believe that you're going to see a lot more 4-2-5 this year. So, 4-2-5 base with some 3-man adjustments off of it is what I would expect for this offense. For this defense, excuse me. Wanted to hit on, I think this is the last question. So we'll work through this question here. Archer said, Ryan, if you covered Ohio State for a living, what matchups would you want to see them take advantage of if you're Notre Dame? So, Archer kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think the easy one for me is, right now, I think that the position that I have the most question marks is boundary corner with Clarence Lewis. That's the big one for me, is that, like, I want to see how he handles going up against guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., Jackson Smith, and Jigba. That's where I would go early. I wouldn't test Cam Hart too much. I just wouldn't. If it is, it's off of manufacturing some space with some crossers, mesh, all that good stuff, right? Like, I wouldn't do it just to do it. Like, there would be a function behind getting someone open in that equation. But, there's going to be times in this game, if I was the offensive coordinator for Ohio State, I would say, like, hey, man, we have a 1-on-1 outside. Let's see if we can get a play against number 6, and let's see what he does with it, right? Like, it'd be almost like a testing point for me. So, wide receivers should have advantages in spots. I think that Tariq Brace is going to be pretty good in the slot. Rover, I think, is going to be fine, but I would put Jackson Smith and Jigba in the slot. and I would tell them, like, let's go to work there, man. Like, let's get some quick separation, instant separation, create some easy plays early on for CJ, get the football out of his hands and see what you can do inside, right? So I think that for me, like, that's the biggest thing is you need to take advantage of the space players you have offensively. Defensively, I think that where Ohio State can win for me is with interior pressure, right? Like we have Josh Lugg, who has played some inside at guard, but he's making the transition this offseason. Jared Patterson's moving to a new position, and he's also questionable for the game. You might have Andrew Kristofican, who played some football, solid football last year, but was unspectacular at times. And you have Zeke Correll, who the last time we saw Zeke Correll wasn't playing very good football. So I think that they'll have some struggles beating the offensive tackles consistently, but interior, I think you can take advantage of stuff. So Talik Williams, I think, could have a nice game. I think that if you have Steel Chambers, the late blitz, A and B gap, I think that there's some interior pressure that you can cause if you are Ohio State on defense. And right now, if I was Ohio State, I'd be like Cam Brown and the other corner, the freshman's name from last year is escaping me. That's a sophomore this year, 29. Burke. I'm sorry. Completely forgot Mr. Burke's name. But if I'm Burke and I'm Brown, I'm playing a bunch of press man, and I am being pesky at the line of scrimmage because last time you saw Notre Dame's wide receivers, they couldn't get off of press coverage. Like, they didn't have release package, right? I want to test Chancey Stuckey and his teachings to see how much this wide receiver group has really improved. That would be my biggest thing. So I'm pressing the outside. I'm trying to create interior pressure. And offensively, I want to take advantage of my playmakers in space. I think that is the biggest thing for Ohio State, that they have the chance to have a convincing win or just have a win in general, is if they're able to take advantage of those things. So great question, though, Archer. Appreciate you as always for the questions. You're a joy to have in this chat, as is everybody. So want to thank everybody for this portion of the mailbag and also sticking with us through the pre-recorded show where we broke down a little bit of the Ohio State offense and defensive scheme. Before you go, if you could please share this podcast, hit the notification bell, because we'll have a lot of shows this week. Tonight, we'll be back 6:00 Eastern time. Sean Stiers and his son Jesse will be on to talk latest things around the Notre Dame program leading up to the big matchup with Ohio State. So make sure to tune in 6:00 for the IB Nation Sports Talk show. I will be back tomorrow with Mr. Brian Driscoll at 1:00 Eastern. We'll be continuing to dig in to this Ohio State Notre Dame matchup, but make sure you hit that notification bell so you get all the instant and updates on when those shows will be going live. Again, 1:00, 6:00, but things change sometimes and extra shows get added. You never know what's going to happen here at Irish Breakdown. But appreciate everyone for following along. If you're listening on a podcast, if you could also leave a 5-star review, rating, all that good stuff, we really would appreciate that as well. Thank you all for the chat. It was awesome today. Appreciate everyone out there in Irish Breakdown land. Exciting week, exciting times. Have a happy Tuesday. Thank you all so much for joining this version of the Irish Breakdown podcast.